Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for being here on this snowy day. I'm Susie Proctor, Vice Chair of Public Safety and Administration. We have a full calendar today. Chair Keith Hayes will be back shortly. He's presenting a bill in another committee right now. So I'm going to pass it to my Senator Peters at this point.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No problem at all. Just want to recognize all of the members from PST here today. We have Senator Peters, Senator Sailing, and Senator Edwards, Madam Vice Chair. And we look forward to a very robust discussion during this hearing. Thank you again.
Thank you. First of all, we're going to hear from the Department of Veterans Affairs. And what I'm going to do is to introduce the representatives from the department, and then we'll hear from the analysts. Today we have with us the Honorable George Owen, Secretary of the Maryland Department of Veterans Affairs, Mr. Robert Finn, Deputy Secretary for the Maryland Department of Veteran Affairs, Peter Panzer, Director of Finance and Administration for the Maryland Department of Veterans Affairs. Welcome to everyone. At this point, I would like to have the analyst, Andrew Garrison, if you would give us your presentation.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair, members of the relevant subcommittee. I'll be sharing my screen for this presentation. Can you all see my screen? Excellent. As mentioned, this is the budget for the Department of Veterans Affairs. We're showing just about a $4 million decrease in this budget, and that's all in this purple section here. These are reimbursable funds that went to the contractor of the Charlotte Hall Veterans Home in St. Mary's County, and for one-time grant in fiscal 21 from the CARES Act. This is largely what we're going to be talking about in this budget today. As you can see here from this top chart, there isn't a whole lot of other change just aside those reimbursable funds not showing up again in 22. First, looking at how the funding is distributed throughout the Veterans Affairs budget, a lot of the dollars are also in the Veterans Home. Of that $26 million that we're showing there, 24 of that is going directly towards care services, and 20 of those 24 are federal dollars, and those are per diem reimbursements that are being paid by the Federal Veterans Affairs Administration to the state to care for the veterans, and the state is then passing that on to the contractor who's doing the care services. Again, just focusing on the dollar change, we are seeing all of that largely in the Veterans Home. The grant itself was a $4.2 million grant, and that's slightly getting offset by an increase in budgeted amounts for care services going up slightly. And really right there in the Veterans Homes budget is what's driving any change that we're seeing in the Veterans Affairs budget from fiscal 21 to fiscal 22. The Veterans Home itself, and one of the main reason for that contribution to the contractor from CARES was due to how hard the Veterans Home was hit from COVID-19. Charles Hall's Veterans Home is actually the second largest like facility in the state. So a facility that has, in terms of a licensed bed capacity. And at the time of this analysis, when we were writing this back at the end of last month, the 27th of January, we had the Department of Health had reported 63 resident deaths and 1 staff death at the home. And we're showing that here in Exhibit 4. As you can see, a lot of that was towards the front end of the pandemic. Then the agency has reported having different safety precautions that have been put in place since then, as well as it was definitely a challenge early on for everyone to meet some of the challenges of the pandemic, and while we were still learning as to how to best manage the facility and other like facilities in the state. You can see it has tailed off quite a bit here. I do also want to highlight that while 63 resident deaths is a lot because of the size of this facility, on a scale, the rate of deaths on a per licensed bed capacity is actually fairly low relative to other like facilities in the state. So we're not saying that Charlotte's Hall performed worse than any other similar facility in the state, just really showing the scale of the impact of the coronavirus crisis that happened at the veterans home. And because of a lot of those resident fatalities, as well as other restrictions in admitting new residents into the home, what happened was the resident census goes down, and that's what we're showing here on Exhibit 5. That green line I put at the top of your screen, that's sort of the average census. That's where the usual amount of residents in the home are. And as you can see, right when the pandemic starts to hit and some of those fatalities that we showed above occur, the census dips pretty precipitously, and it hasn't really yet to rebound from the data that we've received from the department. And why this is important, and I'm going to linger on here for just a little bit, is because of that funding mechanism for the home that I mentioned briefly at top. Since fiscal 18, what has happened is the contractor who manages the home, so the folks who staff a lot of the individuals there and provide the care services, they pay the state a bed lease amount of $18 a day on a per bed basis. That ends up being just under $3 million. That then comes back to the state from the contractor. That goes into a special fund that was created to help help for sort of other costs, maintenance, upkeep, just a small reserve for the home to use on sort of an ongoing basis. And the federal per diem dollars that the federal Department of Veterans Affairs gives to the state for the care of veterans then passes just directly through the state and to the contractor. So the contractor gets has a little bit more revenue volatility based on the patient census effectively. And so when the census dipped, the federal per diem dollars obviously would dip with it, but the state was largely shielded from those from that revenue, and it was largely felt by the contractor directly itself. And so that revenue dip is what was the reason for this grant from the Federal CARES Act. That grant again was $4.2 million. And it was issued to respond to some of these revenue losses. What we note here is that there were other programs that were also helped, that were designed to help providers who experienced a downturn in revenue during this time, one of which was the Provider Relief Fund, of which this contractor received about $2 million in. When the grant was given initially, that number was closer to 1.3 million, although we were told that it was taken under advisement by DBM when they issued this grant, again, from CARES to the home's contractor. And what the recommendation we're making here is that because this special fund already exists, and that special fund's purpose really is to help support this home, and instead of using that fund to sort of smooth out some of these revenue losses by the contractor, instead CARES dollars were used. What we're recommending here is a transfer from that bed lease fund of $1 million to the general fund as a way to offset or account for the Charlotte Hall Veterans Home Fund going untouched during this time of revenue downturn from the home. Ultimately, that is the only recommendation that we have with this budget. We are concurring with everything else in the governor's allowance. That concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Chairman McCray. Anyone else have a question? Hearing no questions, thank you very much. And we will go now to the agency to hear the presentation from the Veterans Affairs representatives. Who's going to, is Secretary Owens here? Who is representing?
Madam Secretary Owens is here, but I think he's had a little difficulty at the end getting on the call. I know he was waiting to be let in, and so I know he's in the wings.
Thank you for whoever just unmuted me, Madam Chair, if that was you or Mr. Chair or Andrew or Pete, or whoever just unmuted me. Thank you very much. Got all dressed up here for you today and not even on the screen. I don't understand.
Well, hopefully somebody can get your picture on there. I want to see you.
Madam Chair, I want to start. Oh, there we go. Let me see if this works. There I am.
Yes, yes.
I want to start off by thanking Andrew Garrison for that very fine analysis, and he hit all the points. He's very accurate in everything he described. But from the very start, I'd like to make one thing known, and that is simply that this Charlotte Hall should be treated like every other business that suffered during this ongoing pandemic and shouldn't be set aside because of the way we receive our funding, or, you know, I'm looking at it more as a penalty than anything else. So, but I want to cut to the chase and go straight to this, that we agree with everything that the governor said, as DLS did, with this one exception. But in the state government article 99122, it's very clear under what conditions money can, the bed lease funds are currently required to be reverted back. And this does not meet that threshold. The 1.5 million cited as a closing balance is nowhere near the 2.6 billion. And again, I will cite that article piece again. But it doesn't come anywhere close to the 2.6 million balance that would have triggered the reversion requirement. And again, I'm not going to read this whole thing to you all because you're aware of it. But the CARES Act money grant was made to the contractor, and it was authorized by budget DBM and the Office of the Governor on an urgent basis to offset losses, just like any other business experience all these losses. When we created the bed lease agreement, what we did was offset the losses that we were incurring from the VA proper, who pays us only for filled beds, not the total number of beds that we had, the 454 beds, but only the number of filled beds. And so we experienced losses ongoing. And if you look at the total budget, you see where the majority of our funding comes from. It comes from the federal government. So we cut a deal more or less, and it was incorporated into the law that the bed lease agreement would give us a factual hard number to work with throughout our budgetary process. And the lease money would then go through, or the money from the VA would then pay us through to the contractor. In this case, HMR, who's been with us about 16 years now. Had that not occurred, they would have suffered irreparable harm as far as a contractor goes on a home our size of 454 beds. So again, it was provided on the same basis, rationalized COVID-related relief to any other business in the state. And we would just take exception to that one statement by DLS and would ask for an unfavorable from the committee on this. I'll be happy to answer any questions. Mr. Pantzer is here, as you can see. He's got a bigger picture on the screen than I have, but that's neither here nor there. At this time, Madam Chair, I'd like to turn it back over to you or to Pete for any questions you may have or any of the committee members may have.
Chairman McCray, would you want to ask questions after each person, or did you want to hear from everyone and then have the questions?
I look like Senator Peter has his hand up, Madam Vice Chair. So you want to call on Senator Peters.
Senator Peters, okay, thank you. Can't hear you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Secretary Owens, you are rejecting the DLS cut?
Yes, sir.
Okay, the $1 million. Okay. The second question I have is just very briefly, we have a second quote unquote Charlotte Hall that you're looking at, correct?
Yes, sir.
Can you just tell us where you are with that?
Well, actually, Deputy Secretary Finn is on the call with us, and he has been spearheading that, but we finally located, it's almost like a gift from heaven, if you will. We picked up 140 acres up in Carroll County that belong to the state, specifically to the Department of Public Safety and Corrections. And that land is now ours. It's unimpeded. It's got the driving site for the state and all municipalities actually that have police driving courses to take. It's up there. It's beautiful. And it just came to us. I've been working on this, as you know, for some 16 years, even during my hiatus between times that I was here, left, and came back. So if Deputy Secretary Finn's on, I'd like him to address that. Bob, are you there?
You're muted, Secretary Finn. You're muted. You're still muted.
Okay, well, I thought I unmuted.
Good, you're good. You're
Good
good
now? Thank you very
You're
much. Yes, we're in the process of tomorrow actually having a meeting with the contractor through the efforts of Department of General Services to talk about a process of part 1 and part 2. We've gone through the process with the state to acquire the land. We're getting the process of getting it surveyed. And once we get that survey completed, we have ownership of the property. We'll be able to submit documentation to the federal VA to start that process for the VA to help begin the process of funding the 35% partial that the VA has to fund. And we're also talking to the contractor tomorrow about completing part 1, part 2, which is required by DBM in order to get our funding from the state portion. So we're moving full speed ahead. Again, it's in a short period of time, within a matter of 2 or 3 months, once we are able to locate the property through the efforts of the Department of Public Safety and Corrections and Secretary Green, we've been moving very quickly in order to, 1, acquire the property, 2, get a contractor, again, through the efforts of Department of General Services, and moving as fast as we can to get this done. We're probably, Mr. Secretary, we're probably, how many beds we're short from the VA standard?
List that number at 685, and I'll add a couple of things to it when you're finished with your report.
Yeah, the second home we're looking at as a kind of small home concept, green as much as possible. Hopefully be able to use solar power or geothermal to heat the building. It's right on top of a hilltop on farmland. So it's a beautiful piece of property, as the Secretary mentioned. And we're trying to use the state of the art with all the lessons learned from other veterans homes that have been recently built across the country to make this the most modern 120 bed facility, small home concept possible.
Thank you, Madam Vice Chair.
Senator,
Thank you.
if I may add to that, the concept that Deputy Secretary Flynn referred to is what the VA does now. We are the 4th largest standing veterans home, and of course, we were formerly a military school. When we converted over, we became the 4th largest in the nation. They have since long gone to the small bed small unit concept, where it's almost like a pinwheel with headquarters in the middle, and then the beds in 20 unit facilities, independent facilities around that spiral. But you were here, but I don't know if a chairman was here or the deputy chair was here back then, but we had the site all picked up. The VA came in and ended that because of environmental hazards. We were ready to go up at Fort Howard years ago, and then all of a sudden it just ended quickly. It was pulled away because of environmental, not by the state, but by the feds came in and rejected it after they had approved it. So we lost a lot of ground over those years. Thank you.
Do we have any other presentations from the department? Are there
Madam
any-
Vice Chair, I would just note that Chair Haynes is now in the hearing.
Okay, I'm going to finish this and I'll turn it to him. Any questions from Veterans Affairs? Anyone else have a question for them? All right, thank you very much. And we are now blessed with Delegate Hayes back with us. Delegate Hayes.
Madam Vice Chair, your stewardship of the subcommittee was efficient and effective. I feel like I should probably go ahead and sit back and just relax for the remainder of the hearing.
No way, no way.
But anyway, I have nothing further to add. Just picking up, I just wanted to do 2 things. I wanted to always wish my good friend well, Secretary Owens, who we served many years together in the House of Delegates when we both were younger. And I remember him when he was riding a motorcycle. And so always good to see you, Mr. Secretary. And I always want to reiterate the site visit that we did, the full committee did down to Charlotte Hall, which was really just a good experience, I think, for all the members who were able to attend. And I was a little saddened to see the numbers on last year as related to, I believe, COVID-19, but it looks like you have that under control now and moving forward. So if there's anything that, I'm sort of asking this question in the subcommittees are as well, moving forward, anything that may be lacking that we can be of assistance with the Department of Veteran Affairs on PPE and those types of things, please just let it be known to us so we can keep that on our radar moving forward. And thank you so much for all your service and all.
Mr. Chairman, very much for those kind words.
Yeah. Madam Vice Chair, have we moved to the point where we have any witnesses that have signed up to testify?
I don't have any witnesses.
Oh, okay. All right. Well, with that, I think that will probably conclude our hearing on the Department of Veteran Affairs. And
The members very much. You're very kind as always, and anything we can do, you just let us know.
okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary.
All right. You all have a great day.
Okay. Likewise. If the subcommittees would now turn to the Office of the Attorney General, and I'm pretty sure our Vice Chair mentioned this as well, but I would be remiss if I did not mention personally that the former Vice Chair of this subcommittee, which is now the Vice Chair of the full committee, Vice Chair Mark Chain, is with us on today, and I just want to recognize him as well. And by all means, Mr. Vice Chair, if there's any questions that you have or comments that you want to raise on any issue, please just let us know, and we'll recognize you to chime in. And with that, we will now turn to the Office of the Attorney General. And we have our budget analyst, Madeline Miller. Ms. Miller, would you go ahead and begin when you're ready?
Of course. I'm going to share my screen if I'm able to. There we go. Share. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Madeline Miller, and I'm going to share I'm going to start the presentation for the Office of the Attorney General now. I'd like to begin with the operating budget summary. As is illustrated in this chart, OAG's allowance decreases from the 2021 working appropriation by 12.2% to $45.9 million. This change is largely attributable to a decrease in special funds. The working appropriation includes a one-time grant of $8.7 million for eviction assistance during the COVID-19 pandemic. Before moving on to the rest of the current year analysis, I'd also like to highlight a few actions related to the fiscal 2021 budget. That budget established the Baltimore City Violent Crime Prosecution Division to investigate and prosecute violent crimes, crimes related to firearms, and organized crime in Baltimore City. However, funding for that division was eliminated by the Board of Public Works on July 1st, 2020. The elimination of that division accounted for approximately 60% of the total cost containment actions approved by the Board of Public Works on that date. In total, cost containment measures reduced the working appropriation by $4.2 million. I'd also like to note that the previous budget restricted funds within the Office of the Attorney General to implement a senior and vulnerable adult asset recovery unit based on SB 407 of 2020. The governor vetoed the legislation on May 7th of last year, but $250,000 remained restricted for the working appropriation. No funding was provided in the allowance for such a unit. The agency should comment on the extent to which it could establish a senior and vulnerable adult asset recovery unit in fiscal 21 if the legislature were to override the governor's veto. Now moving to Exhibit 1 on page 3. This gives an overview of the agency spending in fiscal 2022. About 81% of the agency's costs are for personnel. Less than 1% of the agency's budget will go towards its new case management system, discussed further in Appendix 2. Exhibit 2 on the next page illustrates the changes in the proposed budget from the working appropriation. The 12.2% decrease is largely attributable to the reduced allowances for grants and non-governmental entities. This is shown in this description of the Maryland Legal Services Corporation grant. In fiscal 21, OAG gave a grant of $8.7 million to MLSC, which is a nonprofit corporation that was established by the General Assembly and ensures that low-income Marylanders have access to stable, efficient, and effective legal assistance through the distribution of funds to nonprofit legal services organizations. Funds from OAG were made available through OAG's Securities Division and a 2017 settlement with Deutsche Bank. The funds could only be used for housing-related purposes. MLSC's use of the funds are discussed further in the fiscal 2022 budget analysis for the Judiciary. OAG's proposed budget may yet change as a result of a recent opioid marketing settlement, which is not yet reflected in the operating budget. On February 4th, the Attorney General announced a over $12 million settlement against consulting firm McKinsey & Company for unfair opioid marketing. Over $12 million from the settlement will be deposited in the opioid restitution fund with payments ending in fiscal year 2025. Now on page 7 of the analysis, this discusses OAG's personnel changes in the allowance. The budget provides for a net increase of 6 positions, including 2 for the Securities Division, 3 in the Consumer Protection Division, and 1 in the Civil Litigation Division. The new position for the Civil Litigation Division does not reflect the standard 25% turnover rate typically applied for time to hire new staff. DLS recommends increasing turnover expectancy for that position to 25%. This presentation will now turn to a few key observations, with number 1 being that hiring in the Securities and Consumer Protection Divisions remains complex. As mentioned in previous analyses, OAG has noted it needs more employees to handle its increasing responsibilities and workloads, and this is made possible through hiring full-time positions as well as contractual staff. Hiring for contractual positions has been particularly difficult for the Securities and Consumer Protection Divisions, where the majority of the agency's contractual positions are placed. The issue is being partially addressed in the fiscal 2022 budget with the combined addition of 5 positions for these divisions. However, vacancies among regular positions remain a concern for the 2 divisions. There have been 7.7 vacant regular positions for the 2 since June 2020. For example, the same 3 positions in the Securities Division have been vacant for over 12 months, and 2.7 positions have also been vacant in the Consumer Protection Division for over 12 months. This is also true as the number of vacancies above turnover is at its lowest point that it's been in an operating budget analysis since December 2010. Moving now to the second observation, the consumer's recoveries exceeds expectations. The Consumer Protection Division within the Office of the Attorney General assists citizens by providing mediation and arbitration services to consumers to help resolve complaints against businesses and health insurance carriers. As shown in Exhibit 4, OAG recovered $25.9 million in restitution in fiscal 2019, a number that is expected to be volatile from year to year due to the varied caseload. I'd like to note that this graph here also only looks at recoveries. It does not show fund balances. The agency sets conservative goals for the amounts it hopes to recover for consumers, and it has increased those goals according to past performance. The monies OAG recovers for consumers are not always linked to the monies it receives for consumer protection purposes, which are shown in red. Now speaking more about the monies that CPD recoveries, the monies that OAG recovers for consumer protection purposes, we'll now look at Exhibit 5. Exhibit 5 shows recent past and possible reductions to the Consumer Protection Division Recoveries Special Fund. OAG maintains a specific CPD recoveries non-budgeted special fund account that has specific authorized uses and is one of many non-budgeted special fund accounts that OAG maintains. Occasionally, the General Assembly will authorize transfers from the CPD Recoveries Special Fund to the General Fund for use in balancing the budget. Exhibit 5 highlights recent proposed actions to the fund, including actions taken in the 2017 BRFA, which authorized 2 fund balance transfers between CPD recoveries and the general fund, BPW cost containment actions. On July 1st, BPW approved an action to reduce the fiscal 21 general fund appropriation by $700,000. The agency was directed to utilize special fund balances to support operations and contractual positions. That change might become permanent according to if that particular provision is approved in the BRFA for 2021. In addition to making that permanent, the 2021 BRFA also would require the comptroller to transfer $10 million from CPD recoveries to the general fund if OAG does not transfer that amount to the general fund. OAG reports that the CPD recoveries fund closed with a balance of $19.2 million in fiscal 2020 and is projecting a closing balance of $17.8 million in fiscal 2021. Prior to the proposed BRFA actions, the agency is estimating a fiscal 2022 closing balance of $10.9 million. However, that assumption is based on estimated fiscal 2022 recoveries that are $7.2 million below the average recoveries collected over the past 5 years. There is currently no clear reporting mechanism for the balances of these off-budgeted special funds, including the Consumer Protection Division special funds. With the increased use of special funds to balance the budget and support OAG operations, a more complete understanding of the funds maintained by the office would be beneficial. DLS recommends the adoption of committee narrative requesting a report on special funds for off-budgeted accounts maintained by OAG. This is reflected in the recommendations section of the analysis located on page 12, along with the increased turnover for the Civil Litigation Division position. That concludes my analysis. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there any questions for our budget analyst, Ms. Miller? Seeing none. On the House side, I don't see any on the Senate side as well. I think the chair for the subcommittee on the Senate side is going to a bill hearing. So if there are, if there's,
Mr. Chairman,
yeah.
he went to a hearing and asked me to sit in his absence till he gets back.
Okay, I don't, do you see any senators?
No, Mr. Chairman.
Okay,
No.
all right. Moving right ahead. We had the pleasure of calling the agency representative, and that is the Honorable Brian Frosch, Attorney General, State of Maryland, Ms. Elizabeth Harris, Chief Deputy Attorney General, State of Maryland, Ms. Carolyn Kotraki, Deputy Attorney General, State of Maryland, and Ms. Beverly Pavette, Director of Administration. Please welcome, and I hope you brought a formula to stop the ice from coming down outside today. And you can go ahead and start when you're ready, Mr. Attorney General.
Thank you very much, Chairman Hayes. We're doing everything we possibly can about the ice, which is not very much. And I wanted to say thank you for giving us this opportunity. Thank you to Vice Chair Proctor and Senator Edwards. And We appreciate our Madeline Miller for her good work in analyzing our budget and all the time and effort that went into that. You know, I got the brain trust here, so if you have any serious questions, Liz Harris, Carolyn Kotraki, Bev Pivick are extremely knowledgeable and helpful. But since I don't get to see you guys that often, I want to give you some highlights. Use this time as an advertisement for the good work that our office does. And I think, as you know, we worked with you last year to eliminate fee-based driver's license suspensions. And we thank you very much for making that happen. A couple of our cases that are notable, we entered into a $20 million settlement with Wells Fargo to resolve the 2008 financial crisis claims that Wells Fargo misled investors in its issuance of residential mortgage-backed securities. Same thing with the Royal Bank of Scotland. We entered into an $18 million settlement with them. We announced multiple indictments after several very large-scale criminal investigations. And these included indictments against 19 defendants for charges that include participating in a criminal gang, conspiracy to distribute narcotics, and drug kingpin charges, possession of a very large volume of narcotics, firearm-related counts. And then in another investigation, we indicted 15 defendants for charges, again, relating to participation in a gang, possession with intent to distribute of heroin, fentanyl, cocaine, MDMA, and also sex trafficking. We reached an agreement to obtain more than $9 million in debt relief for approximately 1,000 former students of the ITT Technical Institute in Maryland, one of these for-profit schools that went belly up without providing the education that they promised and that was paid for by their students. We reached a settlement of $4.4 million with Novartis Pharmaceutical for Medicaid fraud. And we went after hundreds of folks who were involved in price gouging during the pandemic. We worked to protect voting rights. We continued our work to make sure that victims of sexual assault were treated fairly, have their evidence kits processed in a timely manner. And we filed a lawsuit against the EPA nominally for failing to protect the Chesapeake Bay from upstream pollution that we receive from Pennsylvania and New York. We're really proud of the work that our office has done during the very challenging conditions that we faced during this pandemic. And let me make just a couple of comments on the budget analysis. First, I would urge you, beg you, to reject the governor's proposed reduction of $10 million from the Consumer Protection Division's recovery funds. The Consumer Division is really the heart of our office. It plays a vital role in protecting people who are at a disadvantage and fighting companies who engage in unfair and deceptive practices. In FY20, we fielded more than 35,000 calls, inquiries, and we recovered more than $26 million for your constituents. The proposed transfer would eliminate more than half of the division's existing fund balance, and it funds itself. It funds itself entirely out of multi-state recoveries, where we're working with other states across the country. And it works pretty well most of the time, but there's a volatility in recoveries from year to year. The division needs an adequate fund balance to ensure that it continue to provide these critical services and to fund them properly. And it also needs funds to address the unmet needs of consumers. There are enforcement cases that should be brought, but can't be brought because of the division's limited staff. We've got a series of cases that we know of where we could bring money home to the state if we had the resources to do it, and we just don't. We have to prioritize, and we do a good job of that. But we could do a much better job if we had more resources. And while the recoveries that we bring to the state aren't the motivating factor in our enforcement actions, our past experience demonstrates that investments that you all have made in the past in our division leads to better results for consumers. And finally, we need the money to continue the consumer division's contributions to the office as a whole. Part of the 2021 cost containment, we were directed to utilize $700,000 of the division's money to replace general funds, and another provision in the BRFA requires the office to provide funding for the division's financial unit from the division's recoveries funds instead of from general funds. So when you reduce the recoveries fund by more than half, it just exacerbates our existing budget challenges. I also want to flag for you that we lack both a PIN and funding for the special education ombudsman that was created by the General Assembly last session. It was Senate Bill 504, and it requires us to appoint a special education ombudsman. The ombudsman is directed to set up a toll-free number, operate a call center for parents, teachers, and other interested parties who need guidance on the services offered and rights afforded to special needs children in public schools. We think this is a great idea. We requested a PIN or funding from the governor. We did not receive it. We have no resources to meet this requirement. I just wanted to put that on your radar. And finally, I'd like to flag for you what will become a new law, since this body overrode the governor's veto on Senate Bill 407, which created a senior and vulnerable adult abuse asset recovery unit within the Consumer Protection Division. The bill required the governor to include at least $250,000 in general funds in the state budget each year. And we don't have $250,000 in our existing funds restricted for this purpose. If you reject the governor's $10 million cut to the Consumer Protection Division, we could be able to use some of that money for this purpose, though we really do need a PIN to do our job well. We find it's very difficult to recruit and retain qualified people in challenging jobs if we can't offer them permanent employment and the benefits that come with having a PIN. With that, I again thank you very much for this opportunity to be with you, and I would be delighted to answer any questions that you might have. I'm not sure whether any of my folks wanted to add a statement to that, but perhaps they could have that opportunity as well.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Attorney General. We'll open it up to any of your brain trust to add anything for the good of the subcommittees. Seeing, hearing none. Are there any questions from the members for our Attorney General? Seeing, hearing none. Mr. Attorney General, good to see you again, as always.
Thank you, Chairman.
We miss you down here in Annapolis on the other side, chairing JPR, but you're doing tremendous things in the Office of Attorney General. We really appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thanks. Hi to everybody. I miss you guys. Hope we get to see each other in person sometime soon.
Okay, great. I don't see whether there's any witnesses signed up to testify either in favor or against. So I think that concludes the hearing for the Office of the Attorney General at this time. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Okay. If the subcommittee would now turn to our third agency, which is the Judiciary. We have our budget analyst, Mr. Caleb Wise. Am I pronouncing that right, Caleb?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, great. Thank you. Mr. Wise, you can go ahead and begin when you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. So for the Judiciary, one thing I just wanted to note before we get started with the bulk of the analysis is that while the Judiciary's budget request is submitted as a part of the governor's budget, is developed without executive branch oversight. So for the operating budget summary, you can see in fiscal 2022 that it's set to increase by 30.8 million or 4.8%, and it will bring the total to 665.4 million. A little note here at the bottom of page 1, the Judiciary's fiscal 2022 allowance increase. This increase is largely consisted of a roughly $26 million in personnel growth. And I'll speak a little bit more about that later in the analysis. Moving on to Exhibit 1, District Court and Circuit Court filings. You can see here the past number of years of data, and you see there's a noticeable drop in fiscal 2020. This is coincides with the COVID-19 pandemic and the governor's stay-at-home orders, and that's impact on the court's operations as well. And you'll see that throughout some of the other measures as well. Moving on to Exhibit 6, bail reform and pretrial disposition. You can see here that you have the different categories: unsecured release, assigned bail, and held without bail. While generally there still is an upward trajectory in unsecured release, there is a slight dip in fiscal 2020. Again, this is largely due to the impact of COVID-19 and the Judiciary's modified procedures in order to attempt to protect employees and Marylanders. Moving on to the budget portion of the analysis in Exhibit 10, we have an overview of Judiciary spending for fiscal 2022. You can see that 71% of the spending is on personnel. The next largest category you have here is grants at 9%, and then MDEC and IT spending at 3%. And then you have the remaining broken out here on the side. Moving on to Exhibit 12, and I'm going to show a few of the adjustments that are taking place in the fiscal 2022 budget. You can see here the total change for the year. And then I'd like to direct your attention to the fiscal 2022 3.5% merit increase here, which totals to about 8.1 million. And then we also have the fiscal 2022 2% cost of living increase, or COLA, and that's another 5.1. And then down here, we have the annualization of the January 1st, 2021, 2% COLA, and that's being annualized at about 2.6 million right here. Other than the personnel adjustments, we have a $1.6 million increase for the start of the Digital Evidence Information Technology project, and a $1.5 million increase due to the data analytics IT project and the start of that one. I'd also like, because it's been covered before, to draw your attention down here to the increase in the Maryland Electronic Courts or MDEC costs due to custom software development. And that's the increase that you're seeing in the fiscal 2022 budget because of that project. And then down here, you see the total with the other adjustments as well. Moving on to the next page, page 17 and exhibit 13. You can see this, rather than being the entire budget, this is the broken out of the increase in fiscal 2022. 85% of that increase is due to personnel. Roughly 14% is due to IT projects, and then you have the remaining 1% is due to other increased costs. Sorry. On the bottom of page 17, we're talking a little bit about the statewide salary enhancements, and on to the next page. DLS recommends that in order to keep the judiciary's personnel spending in line with other personnel expenses, we recommend deleting the funding for the merit and general salary increases, the 2% COLA, in the judiciary's fiscal 2022 budget request. I'll get a little bit, talk a little bit more about that in the action section as well. Moving on to page 18 and the personnel, there's no increase in personnel in fiscal 2022 over the fiscal 2021 working in either regular or contractual positions. However, with the vacancy rate consistently above 2% and 52.5 positions currently vacated beyond what is necessary to meet budgeted turnover, DLS does recommend increasing the turnover rate to 2%. And I'll show that recommendation in the action section as well. Moving on to our issues section. The first issue that we've identified is the judiciary's response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The Maryland Judiciary has undertaken a range of different operational phases over the past year to protect state employees and Marylanders. And I'm not going to read out the entire portion here, but it details what types of court operations were held during each phase and the length of time over the past year that those phases were operated under. We do ask that the judiciary comment on the impact of COVID-19 on the ability of the courts to fulfill their mission and provide judicial services to all Marylanders. Another kind of aspect of the COVID-19 pandemic and its impact on the judiciary is the Maryland Legal Services Corporation, or MLSC. This was talked a little bit in the previous analysis, and I'm going to go into greater depth detail here. The Maryland Legal Services Corporation is a nonprofit corporation that provides civil legal services to low-income Marylanders. The mission of the Maryland Legal Services Corporation is to provide stable, effective, and efficient and effective civil legal assistance through the distribution of funds to nonprofit legal services organizations in the state. It receives its funds from the interest on lawyer trust accounts, or IOLTA, surcharges from court filing fees, and a distribution from the Abandoned Property Fund. In fiscal 2021, the Legal Services Corporation provided funding for 37 nonprofits to ensure access to legal assistance for Marylanders. However, due to the impact of COVID-19 and the resulting economic fallout, two of the Legal Services Corporation's three funding sources saw dramatic declines. The IOLTA funding was impacted by low interest rates, and the surcharges from court filing fees was also negatively impacted. This is because the Maryland courts were closed in response to COVID-19, so there were fewer filings. And we talked about that earlier in the analysis under the MFR measures section. As a result, the Legal Services Corporation, they had to reduce their fiscal 2021 grants by roughly 9%. And in response to the growing deficits for the corporation, the Maryland Office of the Attorney General, as previously discussed, provided $8.7 million to backfill their grants commitments for that year. These funds must be used for housing security related services. And additionally, Governor Hogan allotted $3 million in CARES Act funding to the Legal Services Corporation to be used for any COVID related legal purpose. Okay. The appropriation for the Legal Services Corporation remains consistent in fiscal 2021 and 2022 at 22 million in the judiciary. We're asking that the Judiciary and the Legal Services Corporation comment on these funds and whether these additional funds will be sufficient to backfill any deficits in the Legal Services fiscal 2021 budget, and if additional funds will be needed in fiscal 2022. Moving on to the next issue, issue 2 on page 20, which is MDEC. The cost of the MDEC project has increased by roughly 2.9 million in the fiscal 2022 budget. That's across the length of the entire project. 21 of the counties in the state have fully implemented MDEC, with Montgomery County being the next to go live, followed by Prince George's County and Baltimore City. And you can see that right here. And by the end of calendar 2022, all jurisdictions in the state are projected to be on MDEC. We're asking that the judiciary comment on why the rollout of MDEC has been slowed, especially due to the fact that COVID-19 has placed the ability to work and operate remotely at such a high priority for most state agencies. Moving on to the next page, in Exhibit 14, you see this is the Judiciary's Information Technology Master Plan. And I'm just going to highlight here, MDEC is at the top, and you can see that change over here in the right-hand column. You can also see the other projects that were mentioned earlier that are leading to the increase in the fiscal 2022 budget. Moving on to the third issue, which is the Circuit Court Real Estate Property Records Improvement Fund, or LRIF. And this was created to stabilize and modernize operations and the land records offices of the circuit courts. It's funded by a surcharge on property matters such as deeds, mortgages, leases, and grants. These items, when filed or recorded, are assessed this charge. In calendar 2011, the LRIF surcharge was increased from $20 to $40 by the BRFA. And that increase was supposed to sunset at the end of fiscal 2020. However, due to actions taken in the BRFA of 2020 in Chapter 538, this made the $40 surcharge permanent. This has stabilized the fund in the long term. However, in the short term, however, long-term stresses on the fund remained. If we're moving on to the next page in Exhibit 15, I've highlighted here kind of how we're going to start seeing those stresses in the long time. You can see the projected structural changes, and starting in fiscal 2021, you start running a negative projection, and it starts eating into the total fund balance here at the bottom. However, you can see there is existing fund balance projected out through fiscal 2025 and later. So, and that's it for LRIF. Next, we're moving on to the operating budget, the actions that DLS is recommending. The first of the actions is to reduce funding to increase the turnover rate to 2%. You can see that here. The next action, and this 2% is more in line with actual vacancies. The next is to reduce funding in the fiscal 2022 budget that provides for the 2% COLA, or generally salary increase, that would take effect on July 1 of 2022. You can see that here, and the constituent amounts across general funds, special funds, and reimbursable funds. The third recommendation is to reduce funds in the fiscal 2022 budget for the 3.5% merit salary increase that begins on July 1 of 2021. And you can see the breakdown of the funds in for this one as well. The fourth one is a piece of language that appeared in last year's analysis as well, which is to restrict funds to implement DeWolf v. Richmond. And any funds that are not expended for this purpose shall be reverted to the general fund. The fifth recommended action is to reduce funding for capital improvement projects and by $500,000. And then we have a number of recommendations for committee narrative. The first is for the attorney to request a report on the appointed attorney program costs and utilization. The second is a report on IT development, and you can see some of the data earlier when we talked about MDEC. The third is to request a report on judgeship needs for fiscal 2023. The fourth and final one is to request judiciary report on court performance measures. This covers some of the information that you saw earlier in the MFR section. So moving on to, those are all the actions that we recommended. So thank you.
Okay, one. Okay, I have to get my screen back to where I can, here we are. Thank you very much, Mr. Weiss. Are there any questions for our budget analysts from any members of the subcommittees on the House side? Senator Edwards, any senators have questions?
I don't see any, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Thank you so much. We will now call up the representatives for the agency of the judiciary, rather. That is the Honorable Mary Ellen Barbera, Chief Judge of the Maryland Court of Appeals. The Honorable John Morrissey, Chief Judge of the District Court of Maryland. Ms. Pamela Harris, State Court Administrator. Ms. Deborah Seltzer, Deputy Director of Maryland Legal Services Corporation. And welcome to all of you. And I can't say I hope you travel safely here because we're all virtual. So with that, Chief Judge, go ahead and begin whenever you're ready. And welcome.
All right. Thank you so very much. Thank you to Chairman McCray, as well, of course, to you, sir, Chairman Hayes, and the distinguished members of the subcommittee. We are pleased to be with you today. It would much be preferred if we could see one another in person, but this is a good substitute. So I will restate who is with me on Zoom this afternoon, and that is, they are, of course, Chief Judge John Morrissey of the District Court of Maryland and Pamela Harris, our State Court Administrator. Again, as we have for the past 8 years, we've prepared a budget that recognizes the need to fund the vital functions that state government must fulfill on behalf of the people of Maryland. Again, we have developed our request with care to ensure that the judiciary is prepared to help meet the challenges facing Maryland as we emerge from the COVID-19 pandemic. The judiciary, I must remind you, is but 1.4% of this year's state operating budget. With that very, very small portion of the budget, we are able to do the work that is essential to good governance in Maryland, even and perhaps especially so during the COVID-19 pandemic that continues to challenge our state and our nation. We, like you, have been challenged to deliver our respective constitutional mandates in ways that none of us ever likely imagined. We always look forward to working together with you on matters large and small affecting the people of Maryland. We are pleased to address the issues and recommendations made by the Department of Legislative Services, and thank you to our analyst, Mr. Weiss, and to work with you in determining a budget that balances fiscal constraints, yet provides the judicial branch with sufficient resources to meet the needs of all Marylanders who require access to justice. We have been and will continue to be the careful stewards of the resources entrusted to us in order to meet our mandate. I turn now to the issues and recommended actions. This year, the Department of Legislative Services has identified 3 issues in its analysis. And the first of those is issue 1A, the Maryland Judiciary response to COVID-19. And I will address that, if I may, now. As we have provided in our written response, given the need for access to justice by Marylanders, even during an emergency, the judiciary, I might quibble with the comment of our analysts, we never closed. We were open from day the first that the pandemic struck in Maryland. We became aware of it. And I wanted you to know that because the judiciary then, throughout this pandemic and through to today, is keenly aware of the need for access to justice. So what we did, even at the beginning, even though some functions did have to be restricted initially, we ensured that core and urgent functions continued to be provided throughout the pandemic. Commissioners and judges conducted bail reviews for those arrested. They heard petitions for protective orders in domestic violence cases. People who were vulnerable before the pandemic found themselves in need of the protection of a guardianship or an emergency mental health examination. Those struggling with drug dependency or mental health issues, or both, continue to need the stabilizing structure provided by their participation in a problem-solving court in lieu of incarceration. That is a very good thing. The judiciary provided all of those things and more. Using a phased approach, as was mentioned earlier, to the resumption of operations, we, leadership and staff, have moved forward. The judiciary installed plastic barriers and implemented health protocols, which I'm sure the committee is, as both subcommittees are happy to hear. The judiciary invested in remote technology, as has been mentioned earlier this afternoon, to allow remote proceedings and teleworking. You may or may not know that the Court of Appeals and the Court of Special Appeals converted in-person oral arguments to remote arguments within weeks of the pandemic having struck our state. And the trial courts quickly adapted to remote hearings whenever possible. Jurisdictions on the MDEC system kept pace with pleadings through telework, with staff working in person in shifts. Maryland Court Help Centers went fully remote and then, when possible, by appointment in person. Mediations were offered and conducted on a remote basis. Justice, I would ask the members of the committee and the chairs and vice chair, justice has moved forward. We monitored health trends and consulted with the Maryland Department of Health. We planned carefully and we moved surely and with certainty at the time up to phase 5 with the resumption of jury trials in the circuit courts in October. Now, before ballooning infection rates throughout the state and nation forced a retreat to phase 3 and then to phase 2, which we did do, and I'll let you know the status of where we are right now. That, of course, circled around and was in response to the holidays toward the end of 2020, requiring us to be more restricted. The circuit, despite our retreat to phase 3 and then further back to phase 2, circuit courts conducted 88 jury trials to their conclusion without a single health incident. With the state's infection rate down below 5% and a strong downward trend in all jurisdictions and vaccinations being administered, we are again expanding operations. I'm pleased to report moving to phase 4 on March 15 and moving to phase 5, including jury trials, on April 26th of 2021. None of this could have been planned, procured, distributed, or implemented without judiciary leadership and staff who have worked tirelessly days and nights, weekends and holidays throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. And I do not exaggerate when I say days, nights, weekends, and holidays, all to allow the judiciary to pivot and respond as nimbly as it has to serve the people of Maryland during this difficult period. I hope you have a sense of how proud and grateful I am for their service. Their service is not just essential to our mission. It has been nothing less than heroic. Without it, the judiciary could not have achieved the levels of operations we did while a pandemic raged. Now moving to issue 1B, and that is MLSC facing severe budget constraints. If there are no questions, I will proceed to that issue. And we have here remotely, I hope she's present, Deb Seltzer, the Deputy Director of Maryland Legal Services Corporation. In fact, I know she is because I heard her name mentioned earlier. She is standing by to comment at the conclusion of the judiciary's testimony, if that works for you, Mr. Chairman, Mrs. Chairman. Okay, very good. Then we will turn to Chief Judge Morrissey, who will respond to issue 2. Chief Judge Morrissey.
Welcome, Chief Judge. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Chair Haynes and Senator Edwards and members of this subcommittees, both of your subcommittees. For the record, my name is John Morrissey and I'm Chief Judge of the District Court of Maryland. The committee has asked the judiciary to report on the progress of the MDEC rollout. As way of background, MDEC is the term, it stands for Maryland Electronic Courts. It's the term used for the e-filing solution and the electronic case management system being implemented in the judiciary statewide. The e-filing system is known as File and Serve and allows attorneys or self-represented litigants to electronically file documents with the court. They can file from their offices, from their homes, or wherever they happen to be. The electronic case management system is known as Odyssey and allows the courts to maintain all case records electronically. MDEC is now live in 21 counties. Only Montgomery County, Prince George's County, and Baltimore City remain. The order of these last 3 jurisdictions was intentional, as the prior 21 jurisdictions all used similar legacy systems. The 3 remaining counties have unique legacy systems, unique both from the other 21 jurisdictions that have gone live and from each other. To match the capabilities of the legacy systems, custom development is needed from the vendor Tyler Technologies. This custom development is extensive and requires regression testing prior to being introduced into the live system. This new development will provide enhanced automation and will be deployed to all the other jurisdictions once it goes live. It effectively takes the system to MDEC 2.0, which if you're involved in any type of development of software, you have to stay current or else you'll fall behind. There have been delays to the intended go live in Montgomery County, in part because of COVID-19 and in part because of delay by the vendor in the development of the needed custom software. COVID-19 caused the judiciary, as Chief Judge Barbera mentioned, to divert significant JIS and other staff resources to enable the courts, both in the MDEC, the 21 MDEC jurisdictions, as well as the non-MDEC jurisdictions, to conduct remote hearings so that the court can continue to operate in the pandemic world. In addition, COVID-19 restricted operations required additional coordination for software delivery, testing, and implementation that collectively contributed to the delay. At the onset of the pandemic, it became important to the judiciary, as you can imagine, to adopt a secure audio video platform, deploy this platform across the entire judiciary, equip the courts with necessary laptops or cameras, and develop a training and best practices protocol for remote hearings. The judiciary was able to rapidly pivot, and all courts have capability to conduct remote hearings and have been conducting these hearings almost from the beginning of the pandemic. Just to give you an idea, since June 1 of 2020, the judiciary has conducted more than 70,000 Zoom meetings with over 470,000 participants and encompassing over 21 million minutes of Zoom time. Ironically, about a week before the pandemic hit, there was a meeting with the Department of Health to discuss a pilot in one location as to what we were referring to then as telehealth, to conduct incompetency and other mental health related hearings remotely. As a result of the pandemic, what had been planned to be phased in over years was implemented in a matter of several months. And my hat's off to the Department of Health because of the cooperation that we've had with them. and the judiciary was using these type of hearings as well as many, many other type of hearings across the state. By all measures, it's been a very positive success, absent, as I'm sure you all have seen recently, the occasional cat attorney or a floating head for both the participants and the court. When the term remote is used, in most instances, it means that one or more participants are calling or zooming into the hearing, but the judge and the clerk are still in the courtroom. This allows the recording of the proceeding through the court recording system. It also aids individuals that may have indicated that they were going to appear remotely or just didn't understand the information and still travel to the courthouse for the hearing. All jurisdictions are capable of doing these type of hearings regardless of whether they are MDEC or non-MDEC counties. There are some courts that have been able to work completely remotely, meaning no one is physically present in the courtroom, including the judge and the courtroom clerk. In such instances, the video platform records the proceedings and the recording is later uploaded to the court recording system. If an individual comes to the courthouse, they'll be given the remote hearings link if they're capable, or the case will be rescheduled. This capability is greatly enhanced in the MDEC counties because we can access documents and transfer documents electronically, regardless of where the judge or the courtroom clerk are located. In addition to COVID-19 related delays, the vendor was delayed in providing the new custom programming needed for Montgomery County and the rest of the rollout of what we're calling MDEC 2.0. However, the new code, there is good news. The new code was delivered in early January, and we're now a month into the testing, and the go live for Montgomery County is presently scheduled for October 26th of 2021. I'd like to thank Caleb, our analyst, for his diligent and hard work in pleasant demeanor and working with us and trying to address all the concerns of the committee. And I really do appreciate his work effort. Thank you, Chair and members of the committee, and I'd be happy to answer any questions, or I would turn it over to our state court administrator for the third issue.
Okay, I think what we're going to do is just hold all questions until the very end, and we'll circle back. So if Ms. Harris, if you can go ahead and begin your presentation, and welcome. Good to see you again. I think you need to unmute.
Thank you. I owe Judge Morrissey $1. That's how we go through this now. Thank you, Chairman Haynes, and good afternoon to the distinguished members of this subcommittee or these subcommittees. For the record, my name is Pam Harris, and I'm the State Court Administrator. On this issue, you have the entire historical outline of the Circuit Court Real Property Records Improvement Fund in your packet, as well as a synopsis in the appendices. But for the purpose of this hearing, I would like to bring just a few historical points to your attention. First, the fund was established 30 years ago with a $5 surcharge on land record recordings, and that surcharge expanded over time to $40. In 2005, the General Assembly mandated that over 256 employees' salaries be supported through the fund, and that still continues today. And then in 2010, the General Assembly required that expenditures for all of the judiciary's major IT technology projects would be paid through the fund. At that time, the General Assembly also diverted to the general fund any future interest on the fund's balance. In 2005, a few case filing surcharges were added in the circuit and district courts on top of our case filings. More recently, in 2020, as Mr. Weed said, indicated, the General Assembly removed the sunset provision and made permanent that $40 surcharge on land records. Now, while the removal of that sunset provision was helpful, it did not solve the structural imbalance of the fund, nor was that ever intended. The lifting of the sunset was only to keep the fund at status quo, which was indeed running a deficit. The analysts suggest that since the expenditures are outpacing the revenues, the judiciary should either seek a fee increase, or we should be deferring our future IT projects to some later date. The major IT projects that are projected by the judiciary are necessary and required to support our existing systems and to provide the judiciary and the many other justice partners we serve with the stability, security, and technical resources that are necessary to function. A lesson learned from the ongoing pandemic and the continuing threats to computer networks, as seen across our state, actually across our country, demonstrates that our projected IT projects are fundamental and needed. The continuing security concerns with IT networks and the projects that are planned by the judiciary are not optional. They are required. So reducing funding for these projects or deferring them to later dates would dangerously limit the ability of the judiciary to provide required levels of service, the resources needed to implement legislation that this body passes every year, and to strengthen the judiciary networks from breaches. Absent any alternatives, the judiciary will need to request an increase in filing fees and in the future to reduce the structural deficit of the fund. If not, we won't have any money moving forward in a few years, in a very few years. Thank you, and I will turn it back over to Chief Judge Barbera since you're taking questions at the end.
Okay, thank you so much.
All right.
Thank you,
Please.
Ms. Harris. Chief Judge, it's a little bit of delay here on this virtual sit-up, so I didn't mean to interrupt you, so go right ahead.
No, it was the other way around, Chairman Hayes. I interrupted you. It's always nice to be able to give the following bit of news. The judiciary concurs with recommended actions 1, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9. I do, though, have to turn to recommend action 2, which we oppose. The recommendation to cut the COLA included in the judiciary budget would be acceptable if the judiciary could be assured that, as documented in the JCR from the 2020 legislative session, funding for the judiciary COLAs be included. That's what we're hoping will happen. This has been done historically and in comity with the other branches in the governor's statewide request for cost of living adjustments. As the members of the subcommittee and its chairs well understand, in the past, once the legislature approved a COLA, funding was distributed via a statewide account. After this did not take place, the judiciary faced seeking deficiency funding to make good on the promise of a COLA for our judiciary staff. I'll stop. Are you getting feedback, Mr. Chair? I'm hearing some, but if it's only on my end, that's fine. I will continue if you can hear me. The recent inconsistency in the distribution of funding for COLAs to the judiciary continues to cause me nothing less than grave concern, as once again we face the potential exclusion from the centrally budgeted fund. Having to include funding for a COLA in the judiciary budget submission also creates the impression that the judiciary's budget is growing at a higher rate than the other parts of state government, whose proposed budgets do not include that funding and whose growth rates do not reflect it. Mr. Chairman, I know, and Senator Edwards, I see you're probably taking the place of Chairman McCray when he disappeared on you. He's probably at another hearing. So Senator Edwards, of course, Chairman Hayes, members of the subcommittees, I urge that we commit to a permanent return to the previous model that had been used for decades. COLA funding for judiciary state employees, like all others, should be budgeted centrally in DBM's statewide program. In order to do so, structural assurances must be put in place. The judiciary is requesting your assistance. Please, please help us to make that happen. I now turn to recommended action 3, which we oppose. I hope you will recall my testimony from issue 1A. I will reiterate that the judiciary's success in providing services, even during the stay-at-home order, was due to the extraordinary commitment and service of leadership and staff. Staff who returned to work in person to serve the public long before there was a vaccine available. Frontline staff who potentially were subjected to unequal risks of exposure. Staff who rolled up their sleeves and did what needed to be done for the people of Maryland. It is my understanding that although the governor has not requested a general service increment for all state staff, service increments of up to 4% have been negotiated for some frontline personnel. In light of that, equity calls for those who have also served as frontline personnel in the judiciary to be eligible for up to a 3.5% merit increment. Their service, members of the subcommittees and its chairs, their service has been selfless, and as I mentioned earlier in my introduction, heroic. They represent the best, in my view, the best in public service. And if merit increases are authorized in the upcoming budget, they have earned the right to be eligible for them. So with that, I will close to Chairman Hayes, to Senator Edwards, to the distinguished members of the subcommittees. I thank you for your attention and ask for your careful consideration of the judiciary's responses to these recommendations. We are, of course, happy to answer your questions, and I, like General Frosch, have the dream team with me, with Chief Judge Morrissey and Pamela Harris. We know that they'll answer wisely any questions that may be posed.
Chief Judge, thank you so much, and thank you for all of the responses and comments from everyone. I think Chief Judge Morrissey, as well as Ms. Harris, and obviously Chief Judge Barbera in your responses. We will now open it up for any questions on any of the issues. But before we do that, I see the Chief Judge. Go right ahead.
I made a mistake. I forgot to remind myself and thereby to remind you that Deb Seltzer of the MLSC had offered testimony. So whenever you want to, I'm assuming she's here and as part of this virtual meeting, and whenever you want her to speak in response to the issue around MLSC, that of course would be a pleasure.
Okay. Yes, I did recognize Ms. Seltzer, Deputy Director of Maryland Legal Services Corporation, as part of the agency represented. So we do apologize. Ms. Seltzer, you can go right ahead, and we'll take all the questions at one time if there are any from the subcommittee, so we can get through all the presentations. So go right ahead. Thank you very much, Chief Judge.
Thank you, Chair Hayes, Chair McRae, members of the subcommittees. My name is Deb Seltzer. I'm the Deputy Director of Maryland Legal Services Corporation. We have filed a written comment in response to the analysis, but thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. As you may know, the MLSC fund is a line item pass-through through the judiciary budget. There is an appropriation level set every year, but that is a ceiling on what MLSC can collect. It is made up of 3 funding sources: a distribution from the Abandoned Property Fund, interest on lawyer trust account revenue, IOLTA, and certain surcharges on court filing fees. As was mentioned in the analysis, The two of those sources and the two larger sources, IOLTA and the court filing fees, were significantly impacted by the pandemic. Interest rates have been set to near zero and are projected to stay that way for a long time. And with reduced court filings, therefore, there were also reduced filing fees. At the same time, MLSC's grantees have seen an uptick in requests for service as the pandemic has created new civil legal aid issues and also exacerbated existing ones. MLSC was very fortunate to work closely with the Office of the Attorney General and the Governor's Office to receive emergency funding, as noted in the analysis. That 8.7 from the Attorney General's Office and $3 million in CARES Act funding was used to meet grant obligations for the current year for fiscal year 21. At the beginning of 21, we did have to reduce our overall funding by 9%. The Relief Act does include $3 million restricted for eviction prevention funding. That is also for fiscal year 21. So for fiscal year 21, MLSC is now in a good budget position. We will be able to meet our grant obligations. Fiscal year 22, however, is a different story because those are all one-time funds. For fiscal year 22, MLSC is currently looking at a probably $6 to $8 million deficit from pre-pandemic levels. So there are several initiatives moving through the General Assembly right now. One would be to increase our distribution from the Abandoned Property Fund, which is MLSC's only amount certain every year. And there are other initiatives looking at the amounts of the filing fee surcharges. So we are very thankful to our partners in the General Assembly who are working diligently to help find more funding for these vital civil legal aid services. However, if these initiatives are not successful, we will be looking at significant grant cuts for the fiscal year that starts July 1st. So we are very thankful and hopeful for success in these initiatives to increase our revenue. And I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Ms. Seltzer. I think that covers just about everyone that we recognized. At this point, are there any questions from the members of either respective committee? Okay, I don't see any on the House side. Chairman McCray, do you see any on the Senate side? Any questions?
Mr. Chair, I have a question.
Go
I
ahead.
am probably blending in. First, Madam Judge Barbera and Chief Judge Morrissey, just apologies for my tardiness. I was in EHE for a committee hearing. I guess starting by saying just thank you for your leadership, especially during this challenging time just for our state, our country, and our jurisdictions. And you all have done great work in reference to our courts. I just wanted, because I came in on the tail of it, Chief Judge, I just wanted to get a better understanding of the merit pay and the salary increase, only because we dealt with this last year. I guess since last year, since our hearing last year, have you all been able to have a conversation with DBM in reference to, I know the DBM and you all were some of the issues in the previous year, but has a conversation taken place since that time?
Senator
You're on mute. You're back on mute.
Okay, Chief Judge, could you unmute yourself? Yeah.
I'm trying.
Okay.
I hope I'm unmuted at this time. Something about my fingertips. I don't know. Getting older, perhaps. Ms. Harris has had a lot of conversations with DBM, and she will be able to bring you up to date on how that is going and the why and the wherefore for what we've been asking for this year.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Senator McCray. It's nice to see you again. We have spoken with DBM. They did provide some COLA money for us this year for the January COLA. That was provided. We're just concerned because it's gone back and forth and back and forth. And then for the increment, the governor negotiated with a number of unions that the chief, already, well, you didn't hear it, sorry. So there's been negotiation with the governor and some state employees, but there was no talk with us, with the judiciary, about any increments for our employees. And as the chief said, we have had employees since day one on the ground working heroically in the courthouses dealing with the pandemic. If there's any time that the judiciary employees deserve an increment, it is this year. They have done yeoman's work in getting us all through the pandemic. But there was no funds, allocated for a COLA or an increment in the governor's budget that's before you. That is why we are here asking for both the COLA and the increments for our employees.
Thank you. And Ms. Harris, this question is probably more appropriate for you too. In reference to the judiciary, I believe that it's supposed to be comparable to the executive branch agencies in reference to the increase that you all receive. Do you believe that, or is there some form of a difference in opinion with that?
Yes, I believe there is a difference of opinion. We have heard that at some years from our budget analysts that, they want us to stay in line with other state employees, but we went and did a compensation study a few years ago with all the courts that are surrounding us in the surrounding states, and found that we were woefully underpaying our employees. And so that compensation study has helped us move along, the General Assembly has helped us, raise the boats, as the chief says. We are trying to get our people up to where other courts are, in the surrounding areas. So, our employees, it takes specialized training. They need to know rules of procedure. They need to know MDEC, and now hundreds and thousands of codes to get things right. There really isn't an employee in the state in another division that has or needs the same type of employee that we do to keep the courts running. They're different types of employees, and even though they may not be lawyers, they are trained in rules of regulation, in laws, in processing. There just isn't a comparable employee on the state side. So, yes, we've heard that at times that we should be, and we don't think that should be the case.
Thank you. I won't hold the committee hostage anymore with any further questions, but I will connect offline with yourself, Chief Judge Barbera and Judge Morrissey, just to make. I've been here for 2 years, so I think that a better understanding of the historical context is probably helpful for me. So just once again, thank you for your leadership. And I see no more questions from the Senate side, Mr. Chair.
Okay, thank you so much, Chairman McCray. Just a quick question from myself, and that is, I just wanted to look at probably Exhibit 3, and this may have been better suited for our analysts, but I'm going to address it to the court as well as the judiciary, rather. When I look at the cases by percentages in district court, circuit court, it looks like criminal foreclosure, juvenile cases since 2016 have really declined. I mean, on the percentage level, fairly significantly. For example, the decline in foreclosure cases has been almost 50%, and juvenile and criminal cases saw a substantial decline of about 41.1% and 41.5% respectively. My question is that a true picture, you believe, as far as the trend is concerned? And would you get that same level of decline in cases if you sort of took out the year that didn't happen, which is 2020, because of the pandemic? You understand what I'm asking? I mean, because a lot of things necessarily may not have happened in 2020. And believe you me, I'm a practicing attorney, and I understand courts were operating because I operate virtually in a lot of proceedings and continue to do so. But I'm just wondering whether, because of the pandemic, the decline numbers are maybe not as reflective as it could have been without the 2020 in the midst. I'll put it that way.
That's a
We
very good
have
question.
seen, oh, sorry.
No. I was going to turn it over, of course, once again, to Ms. Harris, as well as to Chief Judge Morrissey, who will be able to speak certainly to the district courts.
We have seen a decline in juvenile and criminal filings, juvenile in the circuit court, criminal both in the circuit and the district courts. That has been a clear trend downward. Foreclosures, yes, that's been downward too. Now, we're ready, we believe, with an onslaught of foreclosure cases coming June because of the moratorium. So we think there's going to be a big increase. We are also struggling with this year's filings in order to figure out where we should be putting resources, how we should be using those resources, because we don't know if what is going to come up. We just don't know. We did not ask you this year, we did not ask for any judgeships. We didn't even provide a judgeship needs analysis because we need to figure out now what do we do with a year and a half almost, which will be here in the future. How do we figure out with that block of time with all the cases dropping, what we really need moving forward? I'll let Judge Morrissey comment as well on where I missed the point.
Thank you, Pam. And Chairman Haynes, you kind of have to throw out fiscal 20, or at least discount it by a quarter. What we saw was that in March, particularly on criminal cases, and I think in large part due to the governor's stay-at-home orders, there was a precipitous decline. And when I mean precipitous, I mean from tens of thousands to a few thousand kind of arrests during a month, particularly in the city, but almost across the board elsewhere. That started in March and went through about late May, and then I guess it was a good time to speed or whatever during that period of time, because no one was getting traffic citations, or criminal citations were much less. Which presented the court, if you saw our bail reviews, and what Caleb commented on is that it's ticked up a little in fiscal 2020. I don't think that's a real number, because what happened was only the most serious individuals were getting arrested during that period of time. And so, the low-hanging fruit wasn't there. The commissioners still continue to release about 50% of the people at bail review at the initial stage at the commissioner level, but these were much more serious cases that they were seeing, and so the people that were left after that 50% had, the types of crimes that were violent crimes and very serious crimes. So I hope that assists. It's rebounding now. We can see the data going back up, but where I think there'll still be a decline in criminal cases, but it's hard to tell where that's going to end up right now.
Okay, thank you so much. And actually, Ms. Harris sort of got to the point where I was trying to get to, and that is, if the numbers are skewed a little bit, or I shouldn't say skewed, but totally not reflective if you don't discount 2020. You know, what resources, when everything sort of starts to, you know, kick back in, are you prepared? Do you have enough judges? Do you have enough staff? Do you have the resources to deal with the anticipated onslaught of cases and et cetera? That's sort of where I was wanting some feedback. That's something that you don't need necessarily to address in today's hearing, but you can always follow up with the subcommittees as that is moving forward. Just like to keep an eye on it. And with that, I don't think that we have any additional questions that I see on the House side. I do want to just thank you, Chief Judges, Barbera and Morrissey, and our Court Administrator, Ms. Harris, and also Ms. Seltzer as well. I know personally, as a trial attorney, as you know, Chief Judge, who practices quite a bit in circuit court, how challenging it can be. But thanks to the technology that's in place, a lot of our virtual proceedings have run very smoothly. And I got to tell you the truth, I think from the lawyer's perspective, on both sides of aisle, are really preferring some of these hearings virtually as opposed to in-court appearances. So you might want to remember that when moving forward. And
I'm not surprised to hear you. I'm not surprised to hear your comment.
Yeah, I would probably gather some of the judges prefer it too. So, but at any rate, thank you so much for all that you are doing and leading the judiciary and the court through this pandemic and beyond. And with that, I don't see any further questions or comments, and I think that will conclude our hearing for today.
Thank you kindly.
Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Okay, moving right along, we will now turn to, we have two more agencies that we're going to hear this evening. The Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services. We have our budget analyst, Mr. Nicholas Kozelman. Nicholas, you can begin whenever you're ready.
Great, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going to share my screen. I just need co-host capabilities. Okay, and let's see here. Okay, so we'll jump right in. We'll be talking about the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services. We'll start with the operating budget summary. And we can see that it decreases by about $9.5 million or 4.2% in the 2022 allowance. And that's going to be mostly driven by this green bar here. That's the federal funds. The working appropriation includes federal funding from the CARES Act that we'll be talking about a little bit later, but it's not carried over into fiscal 2022, and so it is just reflected in 2021. So that's what's really driving the change there. We're going to jump to Exhibit 2. We have the out-of-home placements per 100,000 youth. We can see that it reached sort of a valley here in 2016 at 5.3 youth placed out of home per 100,000 youth in Maryland. It's steadily increased now to 7.8 youth in fiscal 2019. And so we are recommending that the committees adopt language to restrict funds pending the submission of an out-of-home placement report. That's annual language that we also recommended that the committees adopt last year. Jumping now to fiscal 2020, we're going to touch upon the fiscal 2020 closeout real quick, and we can see that the office reverted $17.2 million in general funds, as well as about $12.5 million in federal funds at the end of fiscal 2020. And we know that about $11.4 million of that money was local law enforcement grants. Right now, it's not immediately clear how much was reverted for each grant fund, but it's something that we are going to discuss in a little bit more detail when we get to the issue section in the analysis. And I'll also point out that in Appendix 2 of this analysis, we have more detailed numbers on the fiscal 2020 closeout. In fiscal 2021, there's a proposed deficiency, totals $4.8 million, and it backfills funding for 2 grant programs. The first is the rape kit testing grant, which receives $1.9 million. The second is the Justice Reinvestment Act Performance Incentive Grant Fund, and that provides $2.9 million. In both cases, these are deficiencies to backfill funds that had been incorrectly reverted in the 2020 closeout, part of that money that we just talked about. And so these funds are necessary to fulfill grant obligations in the agency. In cost containment, there were $5.4 million in cost containment reductions adopted by the Board of Public Works in July 1, 2020. And it's mostly general funds, but in most cases here, there are grant programs that did, take a cut, including funding to the Children's Cabinet Interagency Fund. In most instances, the 2022 allowance does restore this funding. However, it is worth pointing out that the funding cut to local management boards in the CCIF, the $1.8 million noted here, was not restored in the 2022 allowance. Looking at Exhibit 3, we have an overview of the agency's spending, and this breaks down what's included in the 2022 allowance. We can see that the biggest chunk here is 34% for the State Aid for Police Protection. This is a formula-driven grant to local jurisdictions to support law enforcement efforts. There's 20% for local law enforcement grants, an additional 10% for the Children's Cabinet Interagency Fund, and smaller percentages here on the side, Violence Intervention Prevention Program, Baltimore City Crime Prevention Initiative. And so the main takeaway here is that a really substantial chunk of the agency's spending is for grant programming. Well over 50% of the funding there is supporting grants. In Exhibit 4, like I said, we can see that the proposed budget decreases by $9.5 million, or 4.2%. Not so much driven by personnel adjustments. The main takeaways here are that it's coming from general fund and federal fund grants. And just to take a look at some of those big ticket items, we have the Justice Reinvestment Fund. That's the performance incentive grant authorized by the JRA. Considering that there's funding provided in the 2021 deficiency, as well as what's provided in the 2022 allowance, the overall growth in funding there is $1.9 million. And that's mainly driven by the fact that because of the coronavirus pandemic, the sentenced population in Maryland has decreased quite dramatically. The Maryland Criminal Intelligence Network grows by $1.4 million. That's restoration of general fund savings that were realized by the Board of Public Works. And the final general fund grant I'm going to point out is the rape kit testing grant. You may recall last year that there was a 2020 deficiency for $3.5 million that was provided to the office for the purposes of funding a one-time grant to sort of wipe out the backlog of rape kit testing kits in the state. However, as I noted, a portion of that was reverted. And so there was funding included, $1.9 million in the 2021 deficiency, as well as $1 million in the 2022 allowance. And so that change overall is $900 million decrease, between the 2 fiscal years. In federal funds, we have some smaller changes, mostly formula driven to the federal fund grants there. However, the big takeaways are that the Family Violence Prevention and Services Coronavirus Supplement was funding that was provided in fiscal 2021, and only a small portion of it was provided in fiscal 2022 due to the start and end dates of that grant. And so the decrease there is $585,000. The Coronavirus Emergency Supplemental Funding, again, a one-time CARES Act federal grant that was provided in 2021. And so we're seeing a decrease there of $11 million. Some other points of note in the budget is that, as I mentioned before, local management board funding does not seem to be aligning with the programmatic needs. There was the $1.8 million reduction adopted by the Board of Public Works in the 2021 working appropriation. However, that was not restored in the 2022 allowance. And so at the same time, because of the coronavirus pandemic, we have seen a pretty substantial increase in the number of individuals requesting services from local management boards, including family services, food bank services, and the like. And so it's worth noting that there is sort of an incongruency between the decline in the funding provided as well as the number of individuals that are requesting services. Second budget point to discuss is related to the Violence Intervention and Prevention Program. The Department of Budget Management is currently recognizing a $4.7 million fund balance. This is a special fund balance that dates back to fiscal 2019. And so given this fund balance, DLS is recommending that the committees adopt language to utilize this special fund balance to replace the general fund expenditures for the fiscal 2022 grant offerings this year. And that would generate $1.7 million in general fund savings. Jumping to the personnel data, we can see that the total personnel remains steady from the current working year appropriation and the allowance. There's no change between the regular or contractual workers. However, we did notice that there are 3 positions that have been vacant longer than 1 year and 1 position that's been vacant longer than 3 years within the department. And so we are recommending that the budget committees adopt language to delete 2 of these long vacant positions. Both of these that we've identified have no funding associated with them. And this would bring the office's vacancy rate more in line with the budgeted turnover. Jumping now to the issues. The first issue we're going to talk about are some concerns that we have over the grant oversight and grant transparency within the office. Over the past couple of years, the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services has grown from just a public safety grant administrator to one that deals with a wide breadth of services and programming. And so to that end, the amount of grant funding has grown pretty significantly and now oversees $209 million of grants across all fund types. And this includes $150 million of general funds. However, we have noticed that there are some concerns regarding transparency and fiscal management with these grants. If we look at Exhibit 5, we can see the red and purple bars here indicate the percentage of grants that are in regular status or the percentage of grants that are closed with above average compliance. And so that means that these grants are performing just the way that they're anticipated to and as they're required. However, these numbers were not provided in the managing for results submissions that were submitted for fiscal 2022. It's also worth noting here that this blue line indicates the total number of audits completed by the office. And we can see that there is a sharp decline in fiscal 2022. This is of course related to the coronavirus pandemic, the fact that they're not able to perform site visits and receive the necessary documentation from their grant subrecipients. However, it doesn't explain the decline in audits performed prior to the pandemic. There are also some instances where actual grant expenditures and grant reversions have not been able to be reconciled by the Department of Legislative Services. And so just to point out a couple, we have the Police Recruitment and Retention Grant, which received $3 million in fiscal 2020. However, the Department of Budget and Management is recognizing that actual expenditures for this grant were $0. And the office is recognizing actual expenditures of $1.2 million. And so it's not clear why there is a discrepancy between what the 2 agencies are reporting for this grant program. The second one is the Pretrial Services Grant Program. This is one that has gotten a lot of discussion in the General Assembly lately because of several bills that are before the several committees related to the expansion and the changes to the sunset provisions of this grant. Just to give you a brief history of it, it received $1 million in the fiscal 2019 budget to seed the program. And since then, the General Assembly has made several efforts to further finance the program. You may recall in fiscal 2020, the General Assembly restricted $750,000 to finance the program. This was part of a larger funding cut that was provided to TEDCO. However, the governor allowed these restricted funds to be reverted. That said, there is a the fund balance documents provided by the Department of Budget and Management show a revenue and expenditure of about $775,000 in fiscal 2020, but conversations with the office have not been able to identify where these revenues are coming from or what the expenditures have been made to. And so we also haven't been able to find any documentation that demonstrates such an appropriation that would be the revenue for these funds. In fiscal 2021, the General Assembly again restricted $750,000, this time in the Administrative Office of the Courts, to be transferred to the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services to finance this grant. However, the office has stated that it does not have plans to currently request the Judiciary to process this amendment. And this does cut against the intent of the General Assembly, as well as its intentions to further finance this grant. The final thing I'd like to point out related to this program is that there are further discrepancies with the fund balance. DBM is reporting a fund balance of $840,000, while the Office of the Comptroller is reporting a fund balance of $75,000, which is worth noting, again, considering that the General Assembly is currently considering various means to expand the use of this fund. Finally, talking about some questionable grant reversions, as I said before, there was $17.2 million in general funds reverted. A chunk of this is likely due to the impact of the pandemic, the fact that subrecipients have not been able to perform all of their operations and get the funding out the door in a timely manner. However, there is still a significant portion of the money that seems to be reverted to errors in fiscal management. The first being $8 million that had been provided in fiscal 2020 deficiencies that were not accurately accounted for as deficiency appropriations within the agency's fiscal management systems. And this accounts for funding to the rape kit testing grant, as well as technology improvements to the Baltimore City Police Department. There's $3.9 million that was incorrectly reverted to BCCPI and the Violence Intervention and Prevention Program, and $3.3 million reverted across several special fund grants that are financed with general funds. There seemed to be some confusion surrounding the duplication of special and general funds, though generally in these instances, a special non-lapsing grant fund that is financed with a general fund appropriation requires the budget to recognize both general fund and special fund appropriations. So given the degree of the grant reversions or funds that otherwise went unspent, DLS is recommending that the office contract with an independent auditor to review its financial management practices, to reconcile its grant programming, and to report to the General Assembly and the Governor with the findings of this audit and an explanation of any corrective actions taken. Just a further addition to this point, there are 3 JCR responses that are still pending. Those are shown in Exhibit 6 here. The first is a report on victims of crime act spending and outcomes. The agency has noted that there is some technical troubles with the federal grant management system that has impeded them from putting together this report. The second was committee narrative on grants for nonprofits in Maryland. This one has gone currently unsubmitted. And then the third was a report on local management board funding goals. There were funds restricted for this JCR report as well, though the agency has said that they submitted this back in November, though DLS does not have any records identifying or recognizing the submission of this report. The second issue we're going to talk about is the Victims of Crime Act funding and the expenditures. This graph here shows the legislative appropriation and the legislative expenditures from fiscal 2015 through the 2022 allowance, while this black bar on top shows the 3-year federal awards that are coming down from the federal government. The dark bars here show the legislative appropriation, while the actual expenditures are shown in the light blue bar. And you can see that the actual expenditures have grown pretty steadily from 15 through 2020. And it's worth noting here that in 2017 and 2018, the legislative appropriations actually exceed the actual expenditures. which suggests that there are fund balances in these 2 years that were not being spent down by the agency. That story kind of flips in fiscal 2019 and fiscal 2020, where the actual expenditures actually exceed the legislative appropriation, which suggests that the office is making efforts to spend down its available fund balances. That being said, considering that the actual expenditures have risen to about $50 million in the 2022 fiscal year, the legislative appropriation drops back down to below $30 million in 2021. And so this does suggest that the current funding situation is unstable and not able to be maintained at the current level of spending, considering that we can see that the 3-year federal awards that are coming down from the federal government has steadily declined over the past 3 years. And so given the elevated level of spending and the declining federal awards that are financing the state expenditures, it does suggest that the proposed drop in expenditures in fiscal 2021 would have an adverse effect on the continuity of services to victim service providers in Maryland. The second portion of this discussion is related to the grant cycles that have actually closed. And so the VOCA awards are awarded on a 3-year grant funding cycle. So that's to say that the 2015 grant funding cycle was awarded in 2015, but may be expended through the fall of 2018. And so given that funding structure, the only 3 closed grant periods available to us are 2015, 2016, and 2017. You can see in the light blue bar at the top of Exhibit 8, 2.2% of the funding provided in the 2015 grant funding cycle was reverted. And that means that's to say to go back to the federal government. And the percentage of funding that was unobligated and returned to the federal government in the 2016 funding cycle increased to 8.8%. And so that suggests that there's a significant portion of funding that the state had received for the purposes of funding victim services that simply did not get spent. And so it had to get returned to the federal government. On the right-hand side of the chart, you can see 2017. We don't have the data for that yet. And again, that's due to the technical issues that we've discussed. The office is unable to report the data for the 2017 grant funding cycle because of technical issues with the grant management system. And so we are unable to determine how much was spent for direct provision of services and how much was ultimately returned to the federal government. We are making a recommendation that the budget committees adopt language to restrict funds pending the submission of a report on VOCA spending, changes to the continuity of services, and the impact of the changes in the federal funding levels. And the language that we're suggesting mirrors language that was adopted last year by the budget committees in the 2020 JCR. Just to recap our recommended actions, the first recommended action is to delete 2 unfunded and long vacant positions within the budget. And this would bring the budgeted turnover, or rather bring their actual turnover more in line with their budgeted turnover. The second recommendation is the VOCA language that I just talked about, that again, it mirrors the language that was adopted by the budget committees last year. The third recommendation is to restrict funds within the office's budget so that they can consult with an accounting firm, and then to also submit a report on the findings of an independent audit to reconcile their grant and their grant management practices. The fourth is a fund swap, replacing general funds with available special funds for the Violence Intervention and Prevention Program. And then the fifth restricts funds pending the submission of an at-home placements report. Again, similar to language that was included in last year's JCR. And that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Konzelman. Are there any questions from the members of the subcommittee for our budget analyst? Seeing and hearing none. Wait 1 second. I see Madam Vice Chair on PSA, Vice Chair Proctor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think in looking at one of your slides, if I read it correctly, it said that funds would be decreased to the Baltimore City and Prince George's County State's Attorney's Office. And
yes, let me just find that here. So here we have the funding for the Baltimore City State's Attorney.
And so that's decreased to 200,000. What's Prince George's?
Prince George's County here. So there's no decrease from what's currently budgeted in the program. The Board of Public Works did make cuts to the grant that the state provides to the Baltimore City State's Attorney's Office, as well as the Prince George's County State's Attorney's Office. And that funding was not restored in the 2022 allowance.
It would be good to know how that decision was made. Those are two places that desperately need funds, need increases, not deductions. So what was that decrease based on? And I'm not expecting you to necessarily answer it.
Maybe it's possible that the agency may also be able to answer that question as well.
Well, that would be good. I'd like to hear that. The other thing, I just want to make a statement with all the issues that we have with our children involved in the human trafficking issue, bullying, trauma, abuse, and we are giving money back because it wasn't used. That just want to make you cry. Thank you.
Okay, certainly thank you, Madam Vice Chair, and the agency is going to respond, so perhaps they can provide a little bit more insight on your first question or issue. And at this time, Mr. Chairman McCray, are there any questions from any of the senators? I don't see any. Okay. We're going to bring up our agency representatives in this order. Mr. Glenn Fuston, Executive Director of the Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services. Ms. Vanessa Lyon, Chief of Staff for the Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services. Mr. Devon McMillan, Chief Financial Officer of the Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services. And Mr. Andy Baranakis, Legislative Affairs Manager for the Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services. And we also have, we're going to ask them to be on deck ready to testify, the following individuals for public testimony. Rosemary Ramsey, Granillo, Kent County Local Management Board. Keontae Kells, Family Leave of Baltimore. Lisa Jordan, MCASA. Amanda Rodriguez and Kelly Winkbauer, Turnaround Inc. Sarah Kaiser, Family Crisis Resource Center, Allegheny County. Pamela Brown, Maryland Association of Local Management Boards, and scheduled to testify, but who has now submitted written testimony because he's unable to appear, is the County Executive of Howard County, Calvin Ball. So with the agency representatives, you can begin when you're ready, and we're going to hold all questions until all of the agency representatives have responded, and we will ask the subcommittee members whether they have any questions, and then we will go straight into the public testimony for our that have signed up. And there will be a time restriction on the testimony as we are adhering to committee, full committee guidelines. Go right ahead.
Great, thank you very much, Chairman Hayes and Chairman McCray. My name is Glenn Fuse. I'm the Executive Director of the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services. I did want to note that with me is our Chief of Staff, Vanessa Lyon, our CFO, Devin McMillan, and our Legislative Affairs Manager, Andy Baranakis. We are one panel though, sir. So I'll go ahead and speak, and then when you guys ask me the hard questions, I'll pass them off to these fine folks. I did want to also thank you for not having me go right after George Owens, Secretary Owens. That's always a hard act to follow, so I appreciate that very much. But I wanted to thank the chair people. I also want to thank the members of the subcommittee, of course, for giving us the time to go through our budget. And also wanted to thank Nick for his analysis. And although we've had some very good discussions and his patience in getting back to us, or us getting back to him as well. I thought I'd give you a quick overview of our office, since some of us are new here, and then give you a little bit on our strategy, and then talk about our changes, and then obviously get to the specific questions that you had. Everybody, I think, knows that the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth and Victim Services has changed substantially in this administration. Once the Governor's Office of Crime Control and Prevention, we now have a much broader breadth. We've brought the Governor's Office for Children under our wings, and we've also created a Victim Services Unit. So now we're looking at 3 different disciplines, all within our office, and we like the way that those 3 disciplines are working together. We've also expanded the way that we treat our grants and how we're addressing the policy side of the house. So I think we've moved from a simple grant making agency to continue to make a grant making agency. And as Nick mentioned, we've doubled the amount of funding that we have coming to our office that we're managing, but we also have developed a robust policy making entity as well across those 3 different disciplines. The way that we're addressing things with those 3 disciplines, I think, is fairly unique. We look at children and youth. Obviously, we also are working with law enforcement, and we're working with victims of crime. And what we're trying to do with our children is make sure that we have trauma-informed care across the state. And then the way that we're measuring that is we're looking at reducing adverse childhood experiences. Wherever we can reduce ACEs, we're making sure that we're going out and we're doing that. And we're pushing that into all of our grants and making sure that our agencies are working together and aware of that goal when they're working with our children. We're also making sure that there's an overlap and that there's a communication between our children and youth division and our law enforcement division. So in our law enforcement division, we have programs like the Maryland Criminal Intelligence Network, which is going out, it's looking for violent offenders that are impacting our state. We're looking for violent criminal organizations that are human trafficking organizations, drug trafficking, firearm trafficking, and gangs. And we're making sure that we're disrupting and we're dismantling them. But at the same time, we're working with those law enforcement agencies and those law enforcement officers to make them aware of what's happening with the trauma that can occur in those same areas for children. So we have programs like Handle with Care, for example. Handle with Care is a partnership between law enforcement in schools and with our youth serving organizations that notifies schools when a law enforcement officer has witnessed a child that's been involved in a trauma or been around a trauma, so that we can now make that warm handoff, that notification to a school counselor or to someone in the community that knows that there's been a child that has experienced a trauma and that they can get assistance. We're also working with that same law enforcement group, and we're educating them on the victim's needs. A great example of that is with the human trafficking work that we're doing. We're making sure that our law enforcement officers are aware of the services that victims need, especially when it comes to human trafficking, or where sometimes people would look just as a prostitution event. They're making sure that we're actually getting those individual services to make sure that they're safer, more self-sufficient, and aware of information. So those 3 groups are all working together fairly seamlessly. And in the youth and children division, one of the things that we're certainly doing, and we're pushing on this, obviously, as we move through COVID, is our partnerships with local child serving agencies like the Boys and Girls Clubs or other local programming where we can get those children into services. They can work with mentors and they can work with individuals that care about them and help them develop their social and mental capacities. Our law enforcement teams, again, are working with them. On the law enforcement side, we're also working with the Justice Reinvestment Act. We're making sure that we are identifying individuals that can be diverted and deflected from the criminal justice system so they're not going into prisons. And as you heard from our budget analysis, that's working. Our prison population, I believe you're going to hear from Secretary Green after us, our prison population is dropping. And that is much of the work that we are doing across the state with 6 different state agencies, as well as our partners, to reduce the prison and jail population in this state. And that's in part because of the education that we're working on. We're doing that in the juvenile side of the house as well. Obviously, on the victim services side, we're continuing to partner on our goals with the victim services side of the house is to make sure that our victims are getting services that help them with safety, self-sufficiency, and awareness of information. We want to make sure that they're getting out and they're getting that information on a regular basis. And through that program, we're still working with CICB, the Criminal Injuries Compensation Board, which you'll remember came over to our office about 2 years ago, the Sexual Assault Reimbursement Unit, which also came over to our office about 2 years ago. And then we put on top of that all of the victim services that we have as well. So those 3 disciplines are now working in our office. They sit side by side. Well, now they virtually sit side by side, and they're working together in order to make Maryland a safer place to live, work, and raise a family and retire. So in that process, some of the things that have changed in our office since the last time we've talked. Obviously, we brought in CICIB and SARU, like I discussed. We brought in the Governor's Office for Children. I discussed how those 3 things are working together. And then, as you know, we also became an independent agency starting last year. So that transition has been a certain learning experience. We have developed stronger relationships working with the Department of Budget and Management, with the Comptroller Office, as well as our partners in the federal agencies. And as Nick pointed out, that communication is necessary. When we're looking at the funding flow, we get money out of the state dollars. We also get money out of the federal dollars. Those funding comes to the state. We have to allocate it. We have to work with the DBM, and we also have to work with the Comptroller's Office to make sure that we're all in line. We have our numbers in line. And what we've identified is the need to create a system that will help us align those 3 numbers in a real-time fashion. We have that capability now, but we need to make sure that we update it and it's more suited for the robust system that we need in our agency. So some of the things that we've done is we've become our own agency. We've initiated an internal needs assessment where we've identified the need for and the hiring of a chief executive officer. McMillan is with us today. We also identified the same needs that we need more people working to do audits of the grants. Nick pointed out the number of audits that we have has dropped. We've tried to use automation and technology to help us in that. We've deployed a capability of desk audits where we can do some of those remotely, and we're continuing to monitor those grants. We've also done a staff analysis where we're going through and seeing what other staff we do, or what other staff we need in our office. And we have a human resources coordinator that's going through that as we speak to help us with that. We also have consulted with 2 outside companies. We've tried to, we're working with one company right now that is helping us build an infrastructure system that helps us track those dollars that Nick was mentioning between the federal government, the Comptroller's Office, DBM, and our office. We also, back in August, looked to bring in a consulting company to help give us advice and guide us in our business processes in terms of fiscal and grant management. And I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So that's just a general overview of our office. I want to certainly get into the specific things that Nick mentioned and he wanted us to talk about. One of the first things that he mentioned, it was commenting regarding the federal coronavirus funding awarded to our office. There was some question of where that went. We took the CARES Act funding that came to our office. We made 95 subawards totaling $9.6 million. There's another $432,000 that is out there for 2 additional applicants, but they still need to get in some paperwork to us. So we're waiting for that paperwork to come in. Those funds will last through January 31st of 2022. So they have time to work on that. And we'll certainly get you a report that details exactly where those dollars went and what agencies. Same goes for the Family Violence Prevention Services Act. We made a full sum award amount of $602,000 to 17 comprehensive domestic violence centers. And again, we'll provide you with a list to make sure that those get out to you. A couple of other things that Nick mentioned us to, or would like us to mention is the local management board report that Nick mentioned that we did submit in October. Nick, we did go back through our records, and you were right, that net report never made it to DLS. We made a mistake in our internal processing, and because of your help, we identified that problem, and we have now submitted it to DLS as of Monday. So thank you for bringing that to our attention. A couple of the other things that I think that we wanted to address is the funding with the local management boards. I think Vice Chair Proctor mentioned it, also Nick mentioned it, and there was a cut with the local management boards due to the, I just dropped the name. Sorry, Vanessa's trying to help me with the name I saw her.
BPW.
Thank you very much. The Board of Public Works, that reduction came through at 10%, was roughly $2 million. And some of the discussion was, how are we going to go about helping the local management boards continue with that funding? Some of the things that we're doing with the local management boards, one of the most direct things is we've actually taken funding from our other grant programs, and we've made about $2 million of that funding available to the local management boards. They've applied, they've received that funding, and they're utilizing it. They're, of course, always welcome to utilize the funding that we have available through our NOFA process, and we certainly are open to them applying for that. We're working with them wherever we possibly can to collaborate as well, to bring them into the fold and use them as a partner in our efforts to move things forward across the state, especially when it affects children and youth. And I think that that's been working out very well. One of the recommendation number one that Nick mentioned, add language to the budget to delete the current vacant positions from our office. We respectfully disagree with this. I hope that we've shown that our office has grown. Our office has grown substantially. Nick also mentioned that we need auditors. We need fiscal staff, and I think by taking away these positions from our office would actually hurt us. So we respectfully disagree with that. Recommendation number two adds language to restrict funding from our budget until the office submits a report on VOCA funding. We certainly we agree with this recommendation in part. We would make one edit to that. We would respectfully request that that be due on March 1st of 2022. That will allow us to get the data that we need from the federal government and process the report so that we won't be late. Recommendation number three, DLS analyst adds language to our budget, which restricts funds for an independent audit reconciling grant management procedures and expenditures in fiscal year 20 and 21. We agree with this. We also have already started this process. As I mentioned, we began this process in August, identifying a firm to come in and give us an independent overview of what business processes we need and how our business processes work in order to address that. One suggestion that we would have, I think in the language that was submitted, it specifically said an accounting firm. We would respectfully request that this be an independent firm or private firm. I think that if we go with an accounting firm, we're not going to be able to get the robust view of what we need in terms of grants management specifically. I certainly think there'll be an accounting component, but I would not want to be locked into just an accounting firm. The next recommendation number four, converting the VIP general fund funds into special funds. We agree with that. Recommendation number five, adding language to our budget restricting funds of the out-of-home placement report. We disagree with this recommendation. I think that what I would hope that we could do is spend some more time digging into what changes were made in this report. The changes that we made in the report in years past, this report reflected placements throughout the year, and it actually did that at one particular date throughout the year, and it compared those placements. What we did this year, which we think is more accurate, more reflective, and allows us to focus more on the specific individuals, is we actually counted the number of children that were in placements rather than the number of placements. Children can be placed multiple times in a year, so that actually increases the number. And this way, it allows us to actually look at the number of children versus the number of placements, which I think gets more to the point of what we're trying to do. It also allows us to take a snapshot throughout time so that we can look at this throughout the year so that we're not looking at just one date in time, so we can do more of a temporal analysis is what we would recommend. Other than that, we we really thank you for the opportunity to present today. If there's any questions for me, myself and our team would be happy to answer them.
Okay, thank you so much. Delegate Hayes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Director, for your presentation. I appreciate especially your emphasis on our youth and showing up and supporting them, which relates to my question. We know that mental health is a serious issue, particularly during this pandemic for all Marylanders, but particularly our youth. This was highlighted by the Lieutenant Governor's Commission, which I'm sure you're aware of. And what I also know is that your agency has stressed the importance of ACEs as well as providing trauma-informed care. And I certainly agree with that. My question to you is, how many grants does your agency oversee or have allocated that specifically deals with funding for mental health services for our youth?
I'll have to get you the specific number. I can tell you that it's, as you know, and I thank you for pointing it out, we've certainly emphasized that in all of our grant making. So I will certainly get you the number of grants specifically that address mental health and ACEs in our youth. I certainly also agree with you that coming out of COVID, this is going to be a significant problem. Matter of fact, it's something that we brought up on the Governor's Children's Cabinet yesterday, with collaboration from the Department of Education, Department of Human Services, Department of Secretary Schrader, and others, Department of Disabilities, that we have to collaborate. And what we're finding is that we all are doing a lot of work in this world, and that we're going to bring it together under the Governor's Children's Cabinet so that we can make sure that we address it head on. We'll get you that report, sir.
Appreciate that, Director. Mr. Chair, can I have just one follow-up question? Thank you very much. And I appreciate that, Director. Can you tell me what is being done right now, or perhaps give a commitment that we would fund Youth Services Bureau that provides these kind of a mental health and intervention services that we're talking about, that you highlighted in your remarks? What kind of a commitment can I get from you and your agency to ensure that we're funding that? Because as you know, in my county, in Montgomery County, we have 3 YSBs, and they do tremendous work for our youth in terms of intervention, mental health, et cetera. And I want to ensure that, you know, we're not just continuing to fund the 3 YSBs in Montgomery County, but really across our state, especially in the middle of a pandemic, where our youth are sort of dealing with some real challenging life circumstances, right? So can you be specific what your agency is doing and any commitment as to funding for those YSBs?
Certainly. Obviously, we stand behind the Governor's submission of the budget in terms of specific commitments. But what I can tell you is that we've worked very closely with both the local management boards as well as the YSBs to bring together that collaboration and to move forward in that collaboration. I hope that I've made myself as available as I possibly can to those conversations. I think what we simply need to do, my personal opinion, is continue the collaboration between YSBs and other types of organizations in counties, so that we're making sure that we're covering the expanse of what children need across our state.
I appreciate that. That's all I have, Mr. Chair. Hopefully we could work more closely, Director, on ensuring that, you know, that funding is where it needs to be, because that's really my focus, and ensuring that, you know, we're really providing these wraparound services, intervention services for you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You're quite welcome. I see Chairman McCray, and I'll let you go ahead and recognize the senators as well.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Houston, just 2 quick questions. One of them is, you talked about audits, you talked about some of the new things that you're trying. 2016 and 19 from the analysts, it talks about you not doing about 1/3 less of the audits that were supposed to take place. And then it looks like in fiscal year 2020, which could warrant because of COVID, but obviously this was pre-pandemic where you all were cutting back on the audits. First, I find it a little bit concerning, but are you concerned, especially with the reversions that you all have had in reference to specific funding, some of the reports that have not been given in or turned in late that you may have been thought that was given in reference to the audits? And I know that you said that you did agree with a real thorough audit from the analysts, but I guess getting it back up to, or somehow figuring out how to incorporate what already had existed and what was working while trying new things, because what's working isn't working at this moment, just from my side.
Sure. You know, I think that we certainly need to look at those audits. One correction I'll make is that is I believe, and Andy can correct me on this, but the number of audits that we're doing is actually in line with what we're required to do. Just there's a small differentiate there. I do want to do more audits, and I want to get it up to that number that we had before. I think what you'll see is the number of grantees that we have has gone up substantially as well, and we're looking to with our staffing plan, our staffing audit, we're looking to bring in more people to satisfy those audits. So I hope I got to your answer. The answer is yes. I want to get more audits in.
Got it. Quick comment, then I'll move to the next question. Just that because we sit on this committee and we're the oversight for your respective agency, we get a number of contacts from the advocates that you are awarding the grants to, which also have concerns about the reversions of funds going back to the feds or whoever, or our general fund, that you all aren't pushing out the door. So wanted to lift up the audit piece is very, very important. The second one, I read your response to the analyst report, and it talked about the lack of staff. And in his report, he's recommending cutting to. Obviously, you disagree, but help us understand in reference to the position that was recognized in not being there for the last 3 years, and then 2 of them not being there for the last year. What would you do different with those positions? Because you said that there's a staff shortage, but the actions say something else.
Certainly. What we're looking to do is better utilize the administrative fees that we have with our federal grants, as well as our indirect costs, in order to fund those positions. As Nick mentioned, those 3 positions are not budgeted for right now. So we're looking to utilize our admin dollars to better utilize or to fill those positions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay.
Senator Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm going to echo what the delegate said about the youth service bureaus. They come to me every year. They need funding. I know they were moved under your department, but I want you to really, really take care of them. I've got a number in my county. They do great work, and they shouldn't be begging for money every year. They're doing God's work, in my opinion. So if you could help them find non-law enforcement grants, that would be greatly appreciated.
Certainly. Thank you, sir.
Yep. Thank you.
Okay. I don't see any further questions. We will move to our public testimony. Each witness will be given or allocated 2 minutes maximum time for their testimony. And we'll go ahead and begin with Rosemary Granillo.
Good afternoon. My internet did just cut out, so bear with me. Can I share a screen? No. My name is Rosemary. I'm the director of the Kent County Local Management Board here on the Eastern Shore. We're part of our county government. We're one of the smallest jurisdictions in Maryland. Our county has just over 7,000 households and less than 2,000 children in our school system. RLMB connects families to services and opportunities in ways that few other agencies here locally can. We have a staff of just 3, myself, a local care team coordinator, and a basic needs coordinator trying to connect families with housing and transportation and other services. Our success is thanks to strong partnerships and the careful leveraging of state and local resources. I just want to give you an example of how RLMB has been uniquely positioned to respond to the pandemic needs, actually, and thanks to the racial equity work that we've been doing for several years. So a few years ago, the LMB made race equity a central focus of our planning and our programming. We hosted a lot of trainings, and we established a grassroots group that is called the Social Action for Racial Justice. In the first few years, the LMB really was the convener of that group. We built leadership. We were supporting youth and criminal justice dialogues. We worked with the Coalition for Justice for Anton Black. We spoke to our local elected officials about racial disparities in our community. The group has now grown. They stand on their own as an independent organization, and they have really transformed the conversation about race and racism in our small rural community. So in March, when COVID came into our community, it was actually Social Action for Racial Justice that immediately mobilized to respond to the feeding needs for both children and seniors. They fundraised over $80,000 to start delivering food all over the county to every corner, last house, et cetera. And it was the LMB that was able to be the liaison to sustain the work throughout the year through CARES funding. But I think the initiative will wind down in May unless there's other resources identified.
Okay, you're gonna need to wrap up.
Okay, I just have a couple more things. So the county really depended on our office to be able to deliver these services and take care of the human services related needs. And as LMBs are known to do, we leverage multiple funding streams to align our responses and get this done. So the budget cut really does fail to recognize the increased services that we've been able to provide. And the funds from the Governor's Office for Youth and Victim Services has not benefited small jurisdictions like mine. So we have not been able to recover that budget cut. So we would just ask for that to be taken into consideration. Thank you for your time.
Okay. Okay, thank you so much. I think there are also a few organizations that may have submitted written testimony as well. So if you have, just go ahead and just give us a brief synopsis of it. But in the meantime, we're going to call our next witness, Keontae Kells, Family League of Baltimore.
Mr. Chair, can you hear me? It's Demar Millard from
Keontae Kells, but he's the leader of our local management board.
Yes, I know Mr. Millard. Mr. Millard is not signed up. And according to our rules, you can't testify.
I apologize for that.
But I'm going to give you a pass, Mr. Millard.
I greatly appreciate that as I put myself in the mercy of the chairs. Thank you very much, Chairman Hayes and Chairman McCray and members of the House and Senate subcommittees. Demar Millard with the Family League of Baltimore, the city's local management board. Very briefly, I really appreciate all of your support for the Children's Cabinet interagency funds. And really, when we were first hit and confronted with the global pandemic, it really forced us to really be much more innovative and flexible in support of our community partners doing work within the city. And primarily, when we were faced with it as the pandemic unfolded, it really became imminent in terms of the issue as it relates to food insecurity. We were able to mobilize resources and reallocate dollars to support efforts that hired 40 opportunity youth that worked in tandem with the Mayor's Office of Children and Family Success, as well as the Mayor's Office of Employment Development in terms of meal distribution citywide for the course of 8 weeks during that time. And then we were also able to leverage federal dollars by way of the CARES Act funding, in which one, providing support in creating a child care stability fund to support child care, family daycare child care homes within the city. And so basically that was $3.7 million that we had to allocate and grant after it was announced by the mayor within 2 weeks to support 397 family daycare child care homes as well as centers. One of the key things I think is also critically to lift up, which I think Rosie touched on, was just in terms of the cuts that were made in terms of the 10% allocation to all local management boards in fiscal year 21. I think if we would like to ask for the committee to really take clear consideration of that, if there is a consideration of a supplemental budget especially due to the fact that there are discussions regarding a fund balance of $4.7 million to have that at least examined for our fiscal year 22 budget. So thank you, and I'm here to answer any questions by members of the subcommittee.
Okay, Mr. Millard, I think you probably had a timer in front of you. You're right at 2 minutes. Any questions? If not, Lisa Jordan, Ms. Jordan, MCASA.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Lisa Jordan with the Maryland Coalition Against Sexual Assault. We are a state sexual assault coalition, and our mission is to prevent sexual assault, advocate for compassionate care for survivors, hold offenders accountable. We certify the state's rape crisis centers. We're federally recognized across America. In about half the states, the sexual assault coalitions administer funding. We don't do that here in Maryland. However, the office is required to consult with us by state law. So they have some obligations there, and we fulfill them working together in partnership. Two programs are here today to talk about the effect of COVID on rape crisis centers and on their programs. I wanted to specifically talk about VOCA because it's mentioned in your analysis so prominently. As you know, the Victims of Crime Act funds are federal funds. It's important to understand that these support core services, and they have supported core services for many years. This is counseling, this is shelter, this is advocacy. It's absolutely correct. The federal allocation from VOCA is going down. MCASA, however, is advocating that the General Assembly keep grants level during the coming year for the following reasons. The federal government gives states 3 years to spend VOCA funds, and Maryland has not been spending the funds down as noted in the analysis. And we don't know how much money there is. We've asked repeatedly how much money there is in reserves. We have never gotten a straight answer about this. However, we do believe that there is enough funding to keep funds level. Second, we are likely to get more VOCA funding. As you all know, there have been major changes at the federal level, a new president, changes in Congress. Our federal partners have made what's referred to as the VOCA fix a priority. This is not only my colleagues in the violence against women world, this is Mothers Against Drunk Driving, the district attorneys. Folks are all coming together. We've heard from our congressional partners that this is a priority. It's a bipartisan priority to make it so there will be more money coming to the states through VOCA. It's really just a change in how they're prosecuting cases that has had this historic effect on the deposits. So they're much lower now. And finally, and I know I feel almost silly saying this, but we are in the middle of a worldwide pandemic. We are in the middle of a worldwide pandemic, and you will hear from the programs about the effect this is having on victims. We have women and men and children who are trapped inside with their abusers. We have perpetrators who have access to children that they might not have before. We have people who are being sexually exploited because they need to pay rent. We have homeless people who are being sexually assaulted on the streets. It's absolutely correct that we are going to have to do something in the future about the VOCA decrease. I am very hopeful that we are going to have the federal government give us more funds so we will be in a better position. If we're not, then the state is going to need to look at this because victim services should not be this small percentage of the governor's office of crime prevention, youth and victim services budget. This should be core. This is central to what we do in Maryland. We're looking at criminal justice reform. You know, if we want to have criminal justice reform, we need to give victims support outside the criminal justice system. We need to really look at this carefully. And this year, the coming fiscal year, is the worst possible time to cut those grants. So we urge the General Assembly to keep this funding stable. Just keep it stable, give us a chance to get through the pandemic, give Congress a chance to do its work, give us a chance to make progress in the future. So with those comments, I encourage you to read my written comments. Thank you, Mr. Delegate.
Okay, thank you so much for your testimony. We're going to move to Amanda Rodriguez and Kelly is that Winklebauer or Rinkbauer?
It was Ms. Winklebauer. She signed me up.
Okay, all right. Turnaround Inc. Go right ahead.
Thank you so much, Delegate. I'm Amanda Rodriguez. I'm the Executive Director of Turnaround. We are the Rape Crisis Center for Baltimore City and Baltimore County. We're also a comprehensive domestic violence and human trafficking victim service provider. The most jarring moments of the pandemic for us were when a young teenager, a middle schooler, reached out to us via our hotline because her friend was being abused at home and she did not know what to do because of the lockdown. That is who a Rape Crisis Center is during a pandemic. Or another case in which a woman who is stuck at home with her abusive husband and her very young children reached out via Facebook Messenger with only a 10-minute window to get out because her husband was out grocery shopping and only had us to turn to. And that's who a domestic violence center is during a pandemic. Or the therapist who offered to continue to work in the office even as the COVID numbers spiked during the holidays so that the sexually abused 3-year-old that she was serving would not feel abandoned. And that's who we are as an agency. Since the shutdown in March of 2020, Turnaround's hotline numbers have spiked 150%. The shelter calls are up 300%. In April of 2020 alone, our agency spent over $20,000 on hotel nights for survivors fleeing abusive households, compared to the $48,000 that we spent on a 6-month period in 2019. The request for our therapy services is up over 200%, and we're consistently seeing higher wait lists for these services across our region. We're also seeing an increased level of violence in cases of both sexual and domestic assaults. Our VOCA award was cut in 2020, and the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth, and Victim Services worked with us to lessen the impact. But in order to keep our current staffing levels, to keep up with the demand for services, we budgeted out our direct assistance funding. That was the funding that we would have otherwise used to cover the bed nights that I described previously. Any further cuts would impact staffing levels and our ability to serve our communities, which would mean that we would have to tell the middle schooler, the mother, or the 3-year-old, I'm sorry, but we're at capacity and we cannot help you. So we are asking, as Ms. Jordan said earlier, that we keep vocal levels at the same. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Rodriguez, for your testimony. We now have Sarah Kaiser, Family Crisis Resource Center, Allegheny County. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for the honor of speaking with you today. I'm the Executive Director of the Family Crisis Resource Center in Allegheny County, Western Maryland. We provide services to survivors of intimate partner violence and sexual violence here. It is essential to fully fund victim services, including using VOCA funding in the coming year. Intimate partner violence and sexual violence did not disappear with the onslaught of the pandemic. In fact, many experts are calling it a pandemic within a pandemic or a shadow pandemic. We're hearing from our therapists and advocates that the type of violence is becoming more severe, more intense. One woman shared with us that she was still living with her ex because of the current financial crisis. They could not afford to move out separately. One day he came into her bedroom wanting to have sex. She said no, told him to leave. He became enraged, got on top of her on the bed, strangled her with both hands around her neck. He then took one hand, held her arms over her head, and used the other hand to cover her mouth and nose while sitting on top of her. He also picked her up from her bed by her clothes and slammed her to the ground. Another victim shared that her perpetrator had strangled her 3 times within 2 weeks, one time until she became unconscious. Another time he even told her afterwards he thought he had killed her. She still had the finger marks around her neck when we met with her. Yet another survivor shared that her perpetrator had put her in a chokehold. She couldn't breathe. She thought he was going to kill her. He held a pistol to her head and told her, sometimes you just need to shut up. We have to be here for these survivors. We need the funding to address the rise in need, the rise in intensity in the violence, PPE, cleaning services, technology subscriptions, IT, equipment, additional staff to cover the increase in the workload, as well as covering when people are off due to quarantine. These costs are still going to be necessary next year. It is essential for the health of our communities, for your communities, that we continue to receive the same amount of funding, including VOCA funding in the coming year. These aren't extras that we're asking for. They're not luxuries. I implore you to take the safety of your constituents into consideration as you make these difficult budgetary decisions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Ms. Kaiser, for your testimony as well. Allegheny County, it seems like that might be one of the good senators area out there, who I served with on appropriations for many years, Senator Edwards.
10-4.
All right. And we also have Pamela Brown, Maryland Association of Local Management Boards. Ms. Brown?
Good afternoon, delegates and senators. Pam Brown, Chair of the Maryland Association of Local Management Boards and also the Director of the Local Management Board here in Anne Arundel County. You have my testimony and I'm not going to read it. What I want to talk about is the extraordinary work local management boards have done and continue to do in the middle of the pandemic. Anything from food pantries, through internet services for youth who need it, through transportation, we hit the ground running in the most nimble way we could. Imagine then our surprise when in August, we took the first funding cut of $2 million and we continued to work really hard and served another 600,000 people, only to then receive the funding cut in our funding this year. That amounts to $4 million in funding cuts. So I'm going to hopefully say, while I smile at my partner, Mr. Fuston, there is a $4.7 million fund balance, and that's actually more than the cut that we have taken. So I really hope that you think kindly about the work we do and the populations we serve in each neighborhood, all of our very low-income neighborhoods in your communities, and how really important it is now in the middle of this pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Ms. Brown. We now will move to our final witness, Linda Weaver, Ms. Weaver. Go right ahead. Welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. How are you? Thank you very much, senators and subcommittees, and Nicholas as well. As the former CFO for the Governor's Office of Crime Prevention, Youth, and Victim Services, which I refer to also as the office, I sat before you last year, and our analysis in no way reflected the many concerns that Mr. Castleman noted in his current report. Last year, Mr. Castleman received timely, accurate responses, reconciliation data, and report. In addition, under my leadership, my fiscal team and I, we were completely transparent with both state and federal stakeholders. Secondly, the office has a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that the eligible programs are receiving grant funding that are properly managed and monitored. With the countless victims, children, and law enforcement organizations throughout the state of Maryland, especially the grassroots organizations that are trying to create social policy awareness and change, there is no reason why the agencies are not receiving funding if they're eligible. It is unfair and it is unethical to continue to award programs to those agencies that the office considered their favorites, as well as continue to award programs because it's easier to just do the work to make the process simple. In the report, it stated that the auditors were performing less audits. In their defense, the auditors, who are part-time, hardworking, dedicated, and highly qualified individuals, most of them are retired IRS agents. They are performing less audits because they spend most of their time having to do the work that the program staff is not doing, which means that if the program staff is not doing program monitoring, then that means that the auditors now have more work to audit. So therefore, that's why there are less audits being done. Lastly, as a Baltimore City resident, it is hard to comprehend an $11.4 million reversion in law enforcement grants, given the increased crime, especially with juvenile offenders. It wasn't my intent today to sit here and speak ill of the office. However, it is my duty as the former chief financial officer of the office to shed light on the office's inability over the past 5 years to respect federal and state oversight and establish processes and procedures, all of which we can clearly see are the concerns and issues identified in Mr. Castleman's report. I thank you again for your time, and I'm available for questions.
Okay. Thank you very much, Ms. Weaver. Are there any questions from the committees? I see Delegate Alcevera from the House side, and I think that's all I see from the House side this time, but go right ahead, Delegate.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of the panelists for their testimony. My question is to Lisa Jordan with MCASA. I am old enough to remember that a couple of sessions ago, or it was last session, in fact, we were having a discussion about VOCA and VOCA funding and just what we are giving up in essence in federal matching funds in order to support survivors of sexual violence. And I'm curious, just as a follow-up, whether the office or agency, Ms. Jordan, has reached out, worked with you or other folks about funding.
Yes, thank you, Delegate, for that question. I appreciate it. And I want to especially say that I really appreciate the members of the General Assembly, because I think that we have gotten the most communication from leadership at the office when either senators or delegates have intervened. And as an example, at the Family Violence Council in July, Senator Lee was the one who tried to ask a very pointed question about how much is there in reserves? What do we have left? What are we really dealing with here? And that afternoon, we got an email from the office saying that they were going to have meetings with the field to try to talk about these issues. I think what's disturbing is that the conference calls they were having were the next day. So it was troubling. It made us feel like perhaps we weren't really being taken seriously, because this gave people less than 24 hours notice to be on these extremely important phone calls. Similarly, last night at 11:55 p.m., we got a notice of listening sessions about the VOCA deposits that we just discussed. And this I have to believe has a timing that makes me feel that you all are prompting that sort of communication. So I think that there are attempts at communication, but I don't think that it's been particularly open, certainly not always in compliance with the law as the General Assembly has intended it. And so I'm hopeful that we will continue to do more of that, and that frankly, you all will also exercise your oversight. I mean, this is something that has been going on for a while. We had very similar conversations last year, and it is something that other states have oversight on. You do. I hope you exercise that. And of course, always feel awkward about criticizing a funder in any way, and don't want to do that, but want to continue to work in a really more meaningful form of partnership.
Right, and I appreciate that. Mr. Chair, just one quick follow-up, 5 seconds.
Go right ahead.
Appreciate that. And I certainly understand the position that you're in. Again, I'm just coming back to a discussion that I recall us having about VOCA funding, service providers, whether we're providing that funding, et cetera. And I understand the position that you're in, but also I would hope folks would understand the position that we're in as stewards of the public dollar and folks that represent these very people that we're talking about, that we're hoping to help, right? So I guess what I want to know is, from where we were in terms of VOCA funding and victim providers that provide these services to victims and survivors, where are we from then and now, right? In terms of funding, are we in a much better place? Is that level of collaboration? Do you see that funding taking place? And is that funding trickling down to the much needed survivors, right? That's what I'm really interested in knowing.
Yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that. I think that unfortunately funds were cut. I mean, so, and it was very difficult. We did try to have some conversations, and there was a formula that was created that was allegedly to try to make it so services would continue. But at the end of the day, 36% of VOCA grantees had level funding, 64% or 79 victim services programs received cuts, some of them for hundreds of thousands of dollars. And it was done on this idea that, oh, it was because we're going to fund personnel. But it's a little like saying, you know, we've got people who have food needs, and then we have people who have food and medicine needs, and we're going to fund food. Like, the people who need food and medicine are going to have to take some money out of food and put it into medicine. So it it was a formula that really didn't work on the field. We tried to talk to them about it. We tried to talk about some of the flexibility that the federal government gave us. You know, they actually did a really good job about supporting us during COVID in terms of no-cost extensions. Some of the people who were cut because of VOCA, if they just would have been permitted to carry over money past October 1st, for the grants that could, not all of them can, but there were plenty that could, some of them would have been able to ameliorate those cuts, but they were denied that. We tried to discuss that didn't happen. It's really, it's been a difficult conversation on some of those nuts and bolts. So I really welcome Mr. Kozelman's observations and hope we're all able to work together to get this to a better place, because that's what we all want. We want this to work. The final thing I'll just have to mention is people are repeatedly not getting reimbursements. You know, one of our programs almost missed payroll at Christmas time, because the office these are services that we have performed in accordance with grant proposals, and they're simply not getting the money to folks. So there really are just like, there's this layered issues of different issues. And I feel awkward as an advocate because I can't even say yet, yeah, do this, because I don't even know exactly how much there is in reserves. You know, I mean, that's the first thing we need is how much money is there. How much money exactly is there? I do, however, have enough information that I think you can keep things level and stable.
Thank you very much, Ms. Jordan, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
Okay. Chairman McCray, I'll turn it over to you and the senators.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess my question is for Ms. Weaver. Ms. Weaver, you talked about reversions, you talked about the audits, and I know that Director Fuson said that the agency is doing at least the minimum amount of audits that they are required from suggested amount. And I know that we have budget language in reference to doing a robust audit, but are there certain audits that we should be doing of the agency, or are there any suggestions or a certain number of audits that we should be doing? If you could comment on that.
Sure. Thank you. So audits should be done first on a risk-based assessment. So the agency should be doing a risk-based. If you have an agency that has clean financials and performance, you don't do those annual. So they should be doing a risk-based assessment to determine the frequency of the audit and who they're going to audit. But unfortunately, there is no risk-based. I know I just left there and they were developing one. But over a period of 5 years, you know, there has to be one. And most of the time, the auditors, again, are part-time. They are doing audits that are, as we hear about a program that may have some kind of fraud and misappropriations, they immediately jump on those audits. But there is no real organized structure, because it should be based upon a risk assessment of each program. And then that's how the audits are determined to be done, and when and who should be doing them.
Thank you. That's all questions, Mr. Chair. And it looks like no senators have any questions.
Okay, seeing and hearing no further questions from the respective committees, we certainly want to thank everyone for coming out and testifying on these important issues, and also the agency representatives as well. And that concludes our hearing for today. And we're going to turn to our last agency. The Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services Administration and Offices budget. We have our budget analyst, Jacob Cash, and we also have our agency representatives. I'm just going to call them so they will be on deck. That's the Honorable Robert L. Green, Secretary of the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, Ms. Rachel Sessa, Chief of Staff for the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, Ms. Chris McCauley, Deputy Secretary of Administration for the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services, and Mr. Scott Roper, Executive Director of Maryland 911 Board. Mr. Cash, you can begin when you're ready.
Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
So today I'll be going over the administration and offices budget for the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services This includes the Maryland 911 Board, project coordination across the department, information technology, security and intelligence gathering, the capital program, as well as the Maryland Commission on Correctional Standards and the Inmate Grievance Office. If you join me on the cover page, the fiscal 2022 allowance is $350 million, which is a $35 million increase over the working appropriation. If we break down that allowance, 911 grants make up the majority of spending at $185 million. This includes both capital grants from the state fee as well as the county fee that directly supports the operation of 911 centers. There's $105 million for personnel and about $40 million for information technology support, which not only supports the Department of Public Safety's IT, but as well as criminal justice information systems, which are used by other agencies across the state. Moving to the performance evaluation, Exhibit 2 shows the home detention average daily population for this calendar year. And as you can see, it increased dramatically during the COVID crisis. Beginning in April, in January, the population was 128 on home detention. It peaked in August and September at 514, and they're ending the year at about 300 more inmates than they began. So this is an issue with that we'll be talking about with vacancies, where the Central Home Detention Unit vacancies increased this year to 28%. So that's something the department should comment on. In Exhibit 3, we can see the recidivism rates for the department. That first section includes all releases, and 4.7% of the fiscal 2019 release cohort recidivated within 1 year of release. Now, these are single-year recidivism rates. So a recommended action that that DLS is recommending is a report on recidivism that would include 2 and 3 year recidivism rates for the fiscal 2016, 17, 18, and 19 cohorts. That'll allow us to do more analysis and better monitor how inmates, once they're released, are performing in the community. Moving on to the budget change, there is a $35 million budget increase in fiscal 2022, and the majority of that is for 911 revenues. Chapter 301 of 2019 allowed counties to double their fee beginning in fiscal year 2022. So that's why we're seeing that increase there. There's also, right below that, the Central Home Detention Unit medical care increase of over $2 million. That's a reallocation of the medical care contract between the different units of the department. So since there were fewer inmates in the corrections and pretrial detention functions this year, more of that medical care costs was transferred to the administration function because of the CHDU increases. I'll also point out that teleworking has led to some cost changes. In this analysis, there's $1 million decrease in rent costs, but in the department as a whole, there's a $2 million decrease in rent costs. There was an upfront cost of $2.5 million to terminate the leases that those administrative employees previously worked at. The department is working with the Department of General Services to negotiate and finalize all of those closures by the end of this fiscal year. The main administrative complex in Towson will be closed, and that should provide a savings of at least $6 million because there's 8 years left in the lease. And since it's being closed in favor of teleworking, which doesn't have any rent costs involved, there are some laptop and cell phone costs associated, but those have been issued, and most of that would be a one-time expense. So we would continue to see, or would continue to expect to see, additional savings based on this teleworking change. And that's obviously directly related to the COVID crisis and the necessary social distancing. Moving to personnel, you can see the budget allowance of 1,151 positions. There are fewer vacancies in this agency compared to last year, and the overall filled positions increased. When you look at administrative positions across the department as a whole, so including administration at facilities as well as parole and probation administration, those positions increased by 22 in this fiscal year. So that's also excellent to see. It's not a huge increase, but they have been going down in previous years. This chart on vacancies breaks down the different units of the administration function. Administrative services is the largest. That includes things like HR and payroll. There's 89 vacancies currently in those positions. However, I will note that across fiscal division, or sorry, across fiscal series positions, they received an annual salary review grade increase of 6% this year. So we would expect to see improvements in those vacancies as well. I'll also note that the Security Operations Division, which includes the contraband unit, had many more vacancies last year than they do this year. So it's good to see improvement specifically in that unit. That brings us to the first issue, which is that drug contraband fines are up by 230% in fiscal 2020. This chart, Exhibit 7, shows those contraband fines over time, but just for the K9 unit. And as you can see, there has been not many weapons found in the past few years. That's largely attributable to the electronic sensors that the department has established across their facilities. However, you can see that drugs are increasing a lot. And when we just break out the fiscal 2020 contraband fines based on who found them and what was found, we can see that the K9 searches only accounted for a small portion of all contraband fines. Most were found physically, and most of those were drug fines. And strip searches mostly found, or were also helpful in finding controlled dangerous substances. Now, as many of you may remember from the previous year, Suboxone film is the most common form of contraband currently. It is highly divisible, meaning one sheet can be divided into many parts. And so that partially accounted for the large increase in the number of contraband items found because there are just more of them. However, when we look at the number of contraband findings as total events, so they could have found one piece of contraband or 1,000. When we look at those events, there was also an increase in 2020, a significant increase. So we're asking the department to not only comment on this issue, but as well, well, actually, sorry, there's no report on this. I almost misspoke. There was a report last year and that summarized down in the JCR appendix 1. But further in this issue, I'd like to talk about the drone detection program. This is a major IT project. There's also more information found in the appendices. This is a $2.8 million program that was piloted in 2018 to determine if the department could deploy a drone detection system across its facilities. This is being pursued as a full project now, and it's anticipated to make an award for the RFP in this fiscal quarter. So moving forward, the department should have a better avenue for identifying contraband that's entering from at least one source. And I'll also mention that the coronavirus pandemic should decrease the amount of contraband entering facilities because visitation has been severely limited, and there are fewer avenues for contraband to enter even before this drone detection program is deployed. We are asking the department to comment on the increase in drug contraband fines, as well as comment on the drone detection program and any other changes in their contraband interdiction efforts. The second issue we'll be talking about is the 911 program. So formerly, this was known as the Emergency Number Systems Board. However, this was reconstituted as the Maryland 911 Board just in October of 2020 based on past legislation. The average salaries that we see across the counties for 911 specialists begin at about $36,000, and they max out at about $61,000. In terms of next generation 911, this is the move to enhance the overall product of 911 that is being offered to citizens. Text to 911 was completed in 2018. That's the first step of the next generation that allows users to contact emergency services without making a call. There are further steps in the process that will be implemented by vendors that are being individually procured by counties. Some of those have decided to procure in groups. and the results of these procurement efforts and the status of the Next Generation 911 transitions are found in Exhibit 10. There are 18 counties so far that have been granted conditional or full approval of their program plans, and there are 6 that are currently waiting to decide on a vendor. We're asking the Department of Public Safety to comment on any new changes in Next Generation 911, as well as provide an update on how many have completed the go live stage so far for Next Generation 911. In terms of recommended actions, we have 3. The first is the Justice Reinvestment Act report. This provides the cost avoidance information for JRA provisions since the start of its implementation in October 2017. The second recommended action is the position abolishments and reclassifications report. To remind you all, there were 521 abolished positions in the previous legislative session, and in this legislative session, there are 350 required abolishments. So this report will help us determine where those are occurring and what impact they may have. And the final recommended action is the report on recidivism that I mentioned earlier to understand the 3-year recidivism rates, which better describe how well inmates are doing after release. As I also mentioned, there's an appendix for JCR responses from previous years and major IT projects. There are several of them this year, so please review them at your convenience. But with that, my presentation is concluded, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Okay, thank you for your analysis, Mr. Cash. Are there any questions for our analyst? Seeing, hearing none, we will now move to our agency response. And Mr. Secretary, you can go ahead and begin when you're ready, and welcome.
Good afternoon, and thank you. I just want to check my my audio to make sure you can hear me okay.
Yes, we're fine.
Very good. Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Hayes, Chairman McCray, Vice Chair Proctor, members of the Senate Public Safety, Transportation, and Environmental Subcommittee, and members of the House Public Safety and Administration Subcommittee. For the record, again, my name is Robert Green. I'm the Secretary of the Department of Public Safety and Correctional Services. With me today virtually, as noted by the Chairman, is Deputy Secretary of Administration, Mr. Chris McCulley, Chief of Staff, Ms. Rachel Sessa, and Director Scott Roper. The Department continues to and appreciates its collaboration with the Department of Legislative Services and always appreciates Mr. Cash's hard work and thoughtful analysis. DLS analysis contains 3 recommended actions and 2 issues for the agency to respond to. You should have our written testimony before you, and I will start out by saying the agency concurs with all 3 recommendations, Mr. Chairman. The first issue DLS asked us to comment on is the increase in drug contraband fines and information on contraband interdiction initiatives, as well as the drone detection program. The department has seen a significant increase in successful contraband recoveries, which is primarily attributed to the 3 areas that we will talk about. I will also note that assuring the integrity and accountability of ourselves as a department is paramount in this area as well. First, we've experienced a significant shift in how individuals are attempting to smuggle in contraband. In prior fiscal years, in-person visitation was a significant source of contraband introduction. Some visitors would try to conceal and smuggle in contraband and pass it along to the inmates during their visitation. As you know, in response to COVID-19, the department temporarily suspended in-person visitation for health and safety reasons. Individuals are now trying to smuggle and introduce contraband into the facilities via the mail at an increased rate. We've placed a very intentional emphasis and focus on screening the inmate mail in our facility mail rooms so it does not reach our housing units across the state. Second, it's important to consider how concealable some of these substances are. Across the nation, one of the very leading drugs being smuggled into prisons, as noted by our analyst, is the Suboxone. Those attempting to introduce this substance take advantage of the formulation of the drug, which comes in a very thin strip, as we know, and is very easily concealable. Third, the department counts controlled dangerous substances by piece of contraband as opposed to the number of interdiction events where they are recovered. As such, one or two major interdictions significantly impacts that total. For example, in FY19, there were 3 seizures of Suboxone that totaled 513 pieces, and in FY20, there were 12 seizures that totaled 2,337 individual pieces. In terms of our contraband interdiction efforts, I would tell you we have an incredibly impressive special operations group consisting of contraband interdiction teams, hands-on searches in facilities, and not to overemphasize, an award-winning K9 unit, complete with dogs that can detect multiple substances, as well as cell phones and other technologies. A very comprehensive investigation and intelligence structure as well that helps us bring that all together. Specific to the K9 unit, from 2019 to 2020, the department filled 8 vacant K9 handler positions, 6 additional K9 supervisory positions, and added 9 additional K9s. They are indeed a force multiplier in the detection of substances and things that can jeopardize our safety. Their presence allows us to conduct more scans using contraband detection K9s in the institutional mailrooms, as we continue to anticipate an increase here of contraband smuggling through the mail, and as we continue to be responsive. Additionally, the department's investigative and intelligence division works very closely with state's attorneys to criminally prosecute significant criminal enterprise when found. The department is also continuing to work towards the implementation of a drone detection program to further disrupt the potential for contraband smuggling in this emerging area of introduction. The Department of Information Technology was initially responsible for the project, including the development of the request for proposal. It was mutually agreed upon and transferred to the department in 2019. Unfortunately, much had changed in the landscape of this technology, these devices, and quite frankly, some in the area of law. We had to take into account certain and specific needs, the intricacies involved in managing a project, and how this operation works in our correctional facilities. After conducting additional research, one of the key elements that we created was obviously a more current proposal, but we also put in place a requirement for on-site demonstrations. Unfortunately, due to the COVID-19 pandemic, these demonstrations were delayed due to travel restrictions and health concerns. Those demos are currently scheduled and locked in for March, and the vendor that is selected will provide us a timeline of implementation of this very important project. The second issue that DLS asked the agency to comment on is the status of the Next Gen 911 implementation across the counties. While the agency houses Maryland's 911 board, 911 is a county function. The Maryland 911 board has provided conditional approval to 10 counties to migrate to next generation 911. There have been delays in vendor interoperability testing that was required by the board. However, progress is ongoing. The board anticipates that the first counties will go live in April of 2021. One Eastern Shore County has been given conditional approval by the board. That county issued a request for proposals that the 8 other Eastern Shore counties have agreed to use as well. So the board expects to see modified plans for these shore counties in the very near future. At the end of last year, there were 6 counties that had not selected a vendor, and the board has issued deadlines for each of those 6 counties. The board has every reason to believe that these counties will meet those established deadlines. And again, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, the department concurs with the recommended actions, and that includes our testimony. We're happy to be responsive to your questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Secretary Green. Do we have any questions from the members of the subcommittees? I don't see any from the House. Do you see any, Chairman McCray? Okay. I don't think we have any public testimony that signed up. I'm going to go out on a limb and say, Secretary Green, everyone that is with you is there to support your testimony and to offer responses to any questions, right?
That is correct, Chairman. They are the experts that we bring with us to make sure we can cover all those responses.
Okay, well, Secretary is certainly glad to see everyone, and thank you for your patience on today's hearing. We had to double up a little bit because we had to reschedule, and so it's been a long day, but thank you for hanging in there. And with that, I see no more questions or comments from members of the subcommittees, and that concludes our budget hearings for today. Thank you, everyone.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank our Vice Chair for sitting in with us all day today as well.
Excellent job.
Totally agree. Excellent job, Madam Vice Chair. You're on mute, but I know you're telling me that you love me and you're going to vote for all of my bills.
Right. And I'm also bringing ice cream.